Rumpole's Return by John Mortimer. Read by, who else? Rumpole himself. One dark, wet, and almost Arctic night in springtime. In fact, it was Thursday, the 13th of March, and the sort of brutal English weather which ought to have made me profoundly grateful for where I was at the time. A 35-year-old clerk in the Inland Revenue named Percival Simpson left his evening class in Notting Hill Gate and went, as he always did on Thursday nights, into the delectable Drumstick to buy his takeaway supper. The meal in question consisted of a cardboard box in which was stowed a pale and hairy portion of greasy, battery-fed chicken and a number of soggy chips. Having secured this repellent repast, Simpson paid for it with money from the purse which he always carried about his person, and made his way out of the neon-lit splendours of the delectable Drumstick into the stormy unpleasantness of the street. He was going, as usual, to take the tube to his bed-sitting room in Paddington. Exactly what followed never became altogether clear. Prosecuting counsel failed to elicit a coherent story from the various witnesses, and the defence was, as usual, only too happy to allow the picture to remain somewhat opaque. As Simpson walked along the broad and fairly well-lit pavement, he passed a large and rather muddy vehicle. It was later shown to be a Volvo estate car with a Hampshire registration, which drew up behind him. A man got out, of no more than Simpson's age, but of an entirely different appearance. The man from the Volvo was a product of Eton, Sandhurst, and the Brigade of Guards. Simpson had acquired his mastery of mathematics at Stanmore Comprehensive and the North London Poly. It would be difficult to think of two more dissimilar young men than Percival Simpson and the Honourable Roderick, known to his many friends as Rory, Cantor, younger son of the late Marquis of Freeth. And yet they were to be inextricably joined in a famous double act, playing the parts of corpse and defendant in a trial staged before a large public at the Old Bailey. These events might, in the old days, have provided a certain amount of grist to the Rumpole mill, but at the time I was in a deck chair, gently ripening to a roseate hue in the brilliant sunshine of southern Florida, looking out past the golden sand and assorted geriatrics to the Atlantic Ocean. I was in a strange condition which could be described as neither life nor death, but something in between, a kind of air-conditioned purgatory. Not to put too fine a point on it, I had retired and gone to live in America. The summons to this lotus-eating existence had come from my son Nick, always the brains of the family, who had crowned his academic career by becoming head of the Department of Social Studies in the University of Miami. He had also acquired a sizable house with a swimming bath in the garden, a place which his wife Erica mysteriously referred to as the backyard. When I add that Erica was expecting the Rumpole grandchild, and that Nick was constantly arguing that the time had come for me to hang up my old wig, give up the unequal struggle against the forces of law and order, and join him and his wife in a sun-blessed haven far from the piercing draughts of our old mansion flat in Gloucester Road, and the cold winds and brutal proceedings of the Uxbridge Magistrates' Court, you will understand why my wife Hilda was naturally and persistently in favour of this scheme. However, she would never have persuaded me if it hadn't been for the powerful argument advanced by His Honour Judge Roger Bullingham. I lost 10 cases in a row before Judge Bullingham. I've always said that if you could choose your judge, you could win most cases. And to avoid this undesirable result, the authorities award judges to cases by some mysterious system of chance. The night before a case, your clerk tells you which judge you have drawn in the lottery, and when I got His Honour Judge Bullingham for the 10th time, I felt like some Monte Carlo gambler who, against all the odds, faces a record run on the black, leading to bankruptcy and a pistol shot on the terrace. It was clear, of course, that the only way I could really banish Judge Bullingham from my life was to hang up my wig and leave the Old Bailey forever. So we accepted Nick's invitation and moved to southern Florida. On our shopping days after lunch, Hilda and I would take chairs on the beach and go through the back numbers of the Times that my old friend George Frobisher posted to us from time to time. "Oh, that's nice," said she who must be obeyed, clucking approvingly at her copy of the Times. "Queen's birthday honours go to Mrs. Whitehouse and Margaret Thatcher's milkman." There are moments when I scarcely regret my exile from England, and this was one of them. But then I began to read the account of an unsolved London crime. Notting Hill Gate mystery. The Honourable Rory Cantor, younger brother of Lord Freeth and wealthy Hampshire landowner, stabbed in underground station. My God, it is a mystery. What's an honourable doing down the tube like a common barrister? The smile put on it by the elevation of the Prime Minister's milkman faded from Hilda's face. "I wish you'd stop worrying about that sort of thing, Rumpole, now I've persuaded you to retire." "You didn't persuade me to retire, Hilda. His Honour Judge Bullingham persuaded me to retire. Anyway, I was losing my touch. I couldn't have shoveled more customers into Wandsworth if I'd joined the old bill. I tried to forget Bullingham by reading the account of a more or less decent crime. About the time that I was reading the delayed account of the Notting Hill Underground murder mystery, Ken Cracknell, approached the door of my old chambers on which the list of familiar names was painted. Guthrie Featherstone, QCMP, led all the rest, beating by a short head the name Horace Rumpole, which had been crossed out in biro. The Temple sign painter, having never got round to painting it out and moving the other names, Thomas Cartwright, Uncle Tom, Judge George Frobisher, Claude Erskine Brown, Phillida Trant, who has now, in the make-believe world of married life, adopted the pseudonym of Mrs. Erskine Brown, Clement Hoskins, Flavius Quint, etc., etc. Cracknell, a reasonably good-looking young man of 30, with a tumbling lock of black hair, thick eyebrows, and the expression of one who constantly believes that he is about to be insulted and doesn't intend to stand for it, glanced at the list of names, as he had done on many occasions, appeared to notice a glaring omission, and continued on into the clerk's room, looking more resentful than ever. "Mind if I hang up my gear on your door, Henry? Being a squatter gives you no damn place to put anything." He looked at my ex-clerk as if expecting some reactionary opposition to his plan, which he would be able to denounce on a point of democratic principle. He seemed almost disappointed when Henry's only reply was, "That's quite all right, Mr. Cracknell. The Chambers meeting's been going on for about 10 minutes. Cracknell raised his eyes to the ceiling above which, in Featherstone's room, the established members of Chambers were discussing matters of great importance, particularly to him. "This Chambers meeting is the first we've held in the absence of a once familiar figure." Guthrie Featherstone was in the chair. "Rumpole." It was my old friend George Frobisher, now a circuit, or as I prefer to call it, circus judge, who guessed that Featherstone, in his somewhat elliptical way, was referring to the old Bailey hack, now put out to grass in a distant land. "We thought we'd never get rid of Rumpole. We kept giving him farewell dinners," Uncle Tom grumbled. Then up spoke a diminutive grey-haired Welshman with an insinuating voice and the look of a man who could apply a good deal of low cunning to running down cases. He was a practitioner on the Welsh circuit named Owen Glendower Owen, and a recent addition to Chambers. "The man's lucky to have a son doing well at a foreign university, from what I can gather. Very comfortable billet he must have there now." "All the same, Chambers doesn't seem like Chambers without Rumpole," my old friend George Frobisher put in a word for me. "Exactly. We seem to have got rid of this stink of cheap small cigars in the passages. Claude Erskine Brown, never one of the Rumpole fan club, had no regrets. There do seem to be rather fewer villains loitering about Chambers," George admitted. Featherstone called the meeting to order. "I thought I'd take this opportunity," he said, "to raise the question of the other candidate who might share Rumpole's old room with Glendower Owen. As you all know, young Cracknell has been with us during the past year as a squatter. Now here perhaps I should explain a legal term. The average young man, hopeful of pursuing a brilliant career at the bar, cannot start to practice until he finds some set of chambers to take him in. Accordingly, he clings on to his place of pupilage with the tenacity of a drowning man clutching an overcrowded raft. Although he knows he is unwanted, and there is probably not enough ship's biscuits and water to go around, he prefers to hang on rather than brave the dark and hostile waters around him. An ex-pupil in this position is called a squatter. Cracknell gets a fair amount of work. He's about to do a long fraud with Philander Trant and the dirty books case in the north. Glendower Owen seemed to have a more intimate acquaintance with the squatter, whom he seemed to see as a potential money-spinner. "Do we really want dirty books in chambers?" Erskine Brown sounded unimpressed. "Interesting fellow, Cracknell," Featherstone said. "He tells me that he intends to do cases connected with civil rights." "Exactly." Erskine Brown sounded as though his worst fears were confirmed. Miss Trant looked at her husband with a hostility that made Featherstone's heart flutter. "Well, what's wrong with civil rights? Better than civil wrongs, wouldn't you say? Of course Ken's a radical lawyer. I know that's the sort you don't want to have the key of the lavatory, like women and blacks." She started her usual oration, and her husband looked at her puzzled. "Well, I'm not sure Cracknell sounds in the least bit desirable." Erskine Brown looked at his wife. "From what you tell me, Philly, he lives in a commune." "I told you, Claude, that he lives in a community near King's Cross." His wife corrected him and went on, flushed with sincerity. "I've seen Ken once or twice in action down at Bow Street. Believe it or not, he's a very attractive advocate." At which point the door opened and the squatter entered. The others looked somewhat startled, as if they'd been caught out in some discreditable conspiracy. Miss Philander Trant was the first to greet him, using that shortened version of his Christian name which he insisted on to show that he was of radical views, a man of the people, totally without pretensions, and not a pompous barrister like the rest of us. "Oh, hello, Ken," said Miss Trant, almost shyly. "Well, hello." Young Cracknell looked round the room, unsmiling. "Aren't squatters invited?" "Of course." Featherstone was almost too effusive. "And you won't be a squatter forever. We're considering the position of accommodation in chambers now that Rumpole's left." "Rumpole?" Ken Cracknell seemed genuinely puzzled. "Everybody's always talking about Rumpole. I've never met the man." I was standing on the sidewalk of a busy shopping street in Miami. I had bought a new box of small cigars. Hilda was waiting for me in a battered yellow taxi, and I was confronted with an unusual sight in that bustling city. A young man wearing a quiet tie, a clean white shirt, well-ironed jeans, and industriously polished shoes. His hair was short, clean, and neatly parted. He was proffering to me, held between finger and thumb, a large yellow flower. "A sunshine day for you and me, friend and brother," the young man said. "Praise to the eternal sun." I'd been thinking for weeks of the soft rain falling around the Temple Tube Station, but I didn't want to argue. "Want to take your hand out?" he said. He had a bunch of pamphlets. Are you selling something?" I asked him. "Sunlight." The young man was smiling at me. I thought he might be a salesman for picture windows or patio doors. Whatever sort of sunlight he was dealing in, I imagined it came at a fair old price. I opened the taxi door and was about to get in beside Hilda when he said, "Meet and talk." What?" "We shall meet and talk, friend and brother. As sure as the seeds grow in the sunlight, we shall meet and talk." Yeah, sorry, got to get back home now. My son Nick's giving a party, poolside." I shut the taxi door then, but I still saw his pleasant face framed in the open window. He raised his hand in a sort of cheerful salute and said, "Sunlight to children of the sun, blood to children of the dark." As the taxi moved away, I returned the friendliest greeting I could think of. "And a very happy Christmas to you, too." "Rumpole," said she who must be obeyed, "you're holding a flower." Oh, so I am. That evening the guests for Nick's do began to arrive. Professor Nathan Blowfield, head of the legal faculty, a small round man in a tartan jacket, whose health was in constant danger owing to his indulgence in the habit of jogging, and his wife, Betsy Blowfield, both of whom I knew already, a couple who was strangers to me, a very pretty, smiling black girl in a white silk shirt, clean dungarees and gold glasses, and her attendant male, a supervisor from the English department. Their names were announced as Paul Gilpin and Tiffany Jones. "Any time you want to come up to the campus, Mr. Rumpole," Professor Blowfield smiled invitingly, "I'm sure my students would be honored to meet a trial lawyer from England." "Am I a trial lawyer?" I asked him. "I used to think I'd passed the test." The others had wandered away in search of food and drink, and I was left with Tiffany Jones. She seemed a particularly nice girl. I wanted to find out more about her. "What department are you in up at the university, Miss Jones?" "Oh, please, Tiffany." She put a long-fingered brown hand on my arm as she spoke, and I avoided looking for any reaction from she who must be obeyed. "I'm in social economics and statistics." It had to be admitted that the confession was not romantic, although the manner in which she made it was. I've always had a head for figures. Since I was a kid, I guess. I cover the economic statistics for Nick's Department of Sociology. How many one-parent families in inner-city areas take to pinching milk bottles? I knew what she meant. I once had a 12-year-old delinquent for a client who told me his trouble was that he couldn't relate to his mother in a one-to-one supportive relationship. That kind of thing. Tiffany grinned. I like the statistics, but the rest of it's a lot of crap, isn't it? I mean, wherever you come from, you can always choose between God and the devil. Although she was still looking happy and radiant, her words had a sudden, almost chilling seriousness. "Can we choose?" I asked her. "Fate dealt me an old devil called Judge Bullingham for 10 cases running." "No matter what luck you have, there's always a choice between light and darkness. The choice is yours, as sure as the seed grows in the sunshine." I frowned, trying to remember. Her words troubled me like an unfamiliar quotation. But when she spoke again, of course, I got the source immediately. "We must meet and talk on this subject, friend and brother," Tiffany Jones said. "You and I must meet and talk." Hilda interrupted from the middle distance. I looked down and noticed with mingled regret and relief that Tiffany's hand had left my arm. Blood was to prove the undoing of Percival Simpson. Blood, and the fact that he possessed an extremely observant landlady who had never liked him, and had always found his natural shyness and reserve deeply suspicious. As I was giving Professor Blowfield a golden oldie from my collection of legal anecdotes, Simpson was coming down the stairs of his lodging in Alexander Hertzen Road, with his mackintosh over his arm, to meet the inquisitive landlady hovering in the hall. "Just slipping out to the cleaners, Mrs. O'Dwyer," Simpson said in a half-hearted attempt at friendliness, but the unsolicited information immediately attracted her attention to the mackintosh over his arm, and to what seemed to her to be, although faintly, a pinkish stain, only half hidden by the fold in the cloth. So, as soon as her lodger was safely out of the house, Mrs. O'Dwyer abandoned her hoover and went up to his room for a good look round. She saw what she had often seen and disapproved of on previous visits when she did her minimal cleaning. On Simpson's dressing table was a crude and amateurish watercolour, cheaply framed, of a naked couple hands stretched upwards towards a flaming yellow sun in a deep blue sky. Beside it, also framed, was the coloured portrait photograph of a cleric with crinkly white hair, kindly eyes beaming behind rimless glasses, and a deep and healthy suntan. In front of the photograph stood in a votive position a half-burned candle in a china holder. Beside it lay an ornately handled and curved Moroccan dagger in a bronze sheath, and carefully folded and kept in place by the handle of the dagger was a square of white paper through which some scrawled red lettering was just visible. Mrs. O'Dwyer looked at this collection, the only pool of colour in the drab room, and saw nothing that she had not seen before. She looked at the narrow divan bed with its porridge-coloured Hessian bedspread, and the shelf over it on which were lodged a Bible and several volumes on revenue law, together with a tattered copy of The House at Pooh Corner, a relic of Simpson's childhood. Then she opened the wardrobe. There were very few clothes hanging in it, an old jacket, a suit for the very best, a few shirts and underclothes, but Mrs. O'Dwyer looked down at a pile of dirty washing at the bottom of the cupboard. She picked up a shirt and looked at the cuff, and there she found, to her considerable excitement and enormous satisfaction, a stain that was deeper pink, in which the attempted washing had been less successful than the mark on the mackintosh that her secretive lodger had been taking to the cleaners. She went straight down to the hall and telephoned the police. In due course, Percival Simpson made his first appearance in the magistrate's court. It was a short and silent appearance as far as he was concerned, and he seemed to show little interest in the proceedings. As was inevitable on a murder charge, he was granted legal aid, and his case was passed on to an eager young solicitor, Labour councillor and leading light of the local law centre, called Michael or Mike Mowbray. Mike knew Ken Cracknell. They had been fellow students at the London School of Economics, and as anxious to advance his friend's career as his own, he gave the brief in this desirable murder, the sort of case for which in my early years at the bar I would have been tempted to go out and do the deed myself, to the ex-squatter, now tenant of my old room, K. Cracknell, Esquire. Cracknell, although naturally excited as he undid the pink tape which bound the important brief, became increasingly depressed as he calculated the odds stacked against the defence. So he was now sitting in Rex's cafe opposite the Old Bailey, eating some of the superb scrambled eggs that they served there from dawn on, telling his troubles to the portia of our chambers, Mrs. Phillida Erskine Brown, née Trant. She had grown agreeably used to breakfast with Ken Cracknell, who looked this morning with his dark hair and smouldering eyes like a young Heathcliff of the legal aid system. "Just my luck," Cracknell continued to complain. "I thought I'd do my first murder on my own and score a triumphant victory. Now, no way. I'll be a triumphant loser." That letter, Miss Trant had eagerly and helpfully read her friend Ken Cracknell's brief, and had seen the photostat of the strange missive that Percy Simpson appeared to have written in his victim's blood. He looked at her, pleased with her obvious concern. "Why don't we have a hamburger tonight and talk about it? I could show you the commune." "No, I can't. Another time." She squeezed his arm and let it go so she could deal better with her marmalade and double toast. "Another time. You promise?" Ken Cracknell smiled, the effect of which upon Miss Trant was powerful. "All right, I promise," she said. She lit a low-tar, filter-tipped and quite tasteless cigarette, and added thoughtfully, "Ken, about that defence of yours, there is someone who really knows about bloodstains." "Oh, you mean Professor Andrew Ackerman?" Cracknell mentioned the Prince of the Morgues, the best forensic science witness in the business. "He's giving evidence for the prosecution." "No," and Miss Trant breathed out smoke through elegantly flared nostrils, "but someone as good as Ackerman. I could write to him, if you like. Dear Rumpole, It seems ages since you left us, and of course we all miss you. My correspondent, as an advocate, was more ready to say what she thought the tribunal might like to hear than to stick to the strict truth, but let that pass. We've got a new fellow in chambers, though, a rather super bloke called Ken Cracknell. He's always called Ken, which shows that there's simply no side or snobbery about him. Ken's got a murder. It's his first, and naturally wants to win, so I feel it's up to us to give him all the help we can. It all happened at Notting Hill Gate Tube Station. See enclosed cuttings from the Times and the News of the World, which will give you all the gen. But where you come in is with your marvellous expertise on questions of blood. It seems that the client wrote a gruesome sort of letter, probably to the devil or something equally creepy, in the victim's blood. What we want to know is this possible? I mean, wouldn't you congeal or something? I don't really want Ken to know that I've asked your advice, as he's awfully proud and touchy, like all radical barristers, I suppose, and really wants to feel that he's done it all himself. Rumpole? Hilda was calling to me from the other side of the lawn sprinkler as I stood by the post-box on the road at the end of the garden and read this letter, which seemed to smell, even as I held it, comfortingly, of fog and damp and old law reports and breakfast in Rex's cafe. Is there anything in the post? Do write if you can think of any sort of a cunning wheeze for Ken. Hope you're enjoying the sunshine. I do envy you. Phillida Trant, as was Erskine Brown. No, nothing really. Just a postcard from my old clerk. I stuffed Miss Trant's letter into my pocket. For some reason I felt guilty about it, as though I were already plotting the desperate course I was about to take. The Importance of Bloodstains in Forensic Evidence by Professor Andrew Ackerman, M.R.C.P., F.C. Path. The advantages of having a son who has done well in an academic career is that you can have your favorite books about you, even in Miami. I was in the long, pleasantly cool room of the university library. Around me, blonde and bronzed young people dressed in jeans and T-shirts chewed gum and read the letters of Henry James, or some 12-volume commentary on the works of Trollope. I leafed rapidly through Ackerman's familiar index. Bloodstains on clothing, on floors, on innocent bystanders. At first I couldn't believe that the great Ackerman hadn't dealt with the problem, but then I became aware of the fact that Ken Cracknell's murder had apparently broken ground untrodden even by the great prince of the mortuaries himself. I was clutching Andrew Ackerman's weighty volume and crossing the pleasant tree-lined campus, threading my way among the bicycling and courting couples, when I came up to those former barbecue guests, Professor Blowfield of the Law Department and Paul Gilpin from English, together with that distinguished academic young Nicholas Rumpole, head of the Department of Sociology. It's the damnedest thing about Tiffany, Paul was saying as I came up to them. She's just vanished. Vanished? Professor Blowfield was saying. She can't have vanished. Oh, here you are, Mr. Rumpole. It seems we have a mystery on our hands. Mystery? What mystery? Fate seems to have been unusually kind in the matter of handing out mysteries that day. Tiffany Jones never showed up at the department, Nick said. Yet Paul says she left home same time as usual. And there's a young guy on the campus says Tiffany sold him a car yesterday, said Gilpin. He picked it up from the street outside our apartment block with a key on the offside wheel. How the hell's she going to go on living in Miami without a car? She didn't say anything? Professor Blowfield asked. Not that I can remember. I spent only a moment lamenting Paul Gilpin's loss of the handsome Tiffany. She had in any event seemed, as far as I clearly remembered, far too good for him. And then I approached Nick with the first stirrings of my great plan in mind. Nick, I must talk to you. You remember Tiffany Jones, don't you, Dad, the economic statistician? She came to the barbecue. Of course I remember her. But do statisticians ever disappear? She'll call up, I guess. Can't be anything. But Paul Gilpin didn't sound convinced. Oh, perhaps she just melted away in the sunshine. Look, Nick, I'll take you out to lunch. Oh, not the canteen. I don't think I could take another 3-story sandwich with a gherkin on a toothpick. Is there a quiet little chop house somewhere where we could talk quietly? We settled on the Magic Bamboo, a Chinese restaurant just off the campus. Clever little people, the Chinese, who would have made splendid Battle of Britain pilots, because they must be expert at seeing in the dark. The room, painted in black lacquer and gold, was plunged into a midnight gloom, in which husbands no doubt lunched with their secretaries, or other people's wives, or went on what might have been aptly known as blind dates. Faint lights dotted the tables with the effulgence of glowworms, and pretty young Chinese waitresses passed among them with table heaters and bowls of oriental delicacies. Now, not a word to she who must be obeyed, Nick, but I've got to talk to you seriously, I began, and wondered when I had talked to him seriously before. I've had a letter from Miss Phillida Trant, a girl whom I brought up in the law. She's written to me by email, Nick, sparing no expense. It seems they've got a murder, which raises several nice questions of blood. So the cry has gone up from Equity Court in the Temple, "Send for Rumpole." Dad, you're not thinking of going back? It was a direct question, and I decided to put off answering it by swigging the red wine the Chinese waitress had thoughtfully delivered. What's this? More Californian claret? Chateau Deadwood Stage? Yeah, it's not bad, Nick, not bad at all. A waitress passed with a tray loaded with small, steaming, cylindrical white objects. With the aid of a pair of tongs, she deposited one of these on each of our side plates. What are you planning? Nick looked at me with deepening suspicion. I took another swig of Chateau Cherokee, or whatever it was, and told him, "Going home, Nick. Returning to base. Travel, you see, narrows the mind extraordinarily." I peered through the blackout at the steaming shape on my side plate. Oh, good, they brought us something to eat at last. I rather like egg rolls, and before Nick could intervene, I had seized the imagined delicacy and suddenly filled my mouth with what tasted like a mixture of warm-scented soap and cotton fibres. The American passion for hygiene and dark restaurants had made me start my luncheon with an hors d'oeuvre of hot face towel. Phillida Trant and Ken Cracknell, after a hard day in their respective courts, were refreshing themselves in Pomeroy's wine bar. Cracknell asked if she'd join him in a hamburger. "Claude's getting a babysitter. We're going to the festival hall. But I promise—" "What?" "I'll turn you over in my mind during the Verdi Requiem." Miss Trant smiled at him. "Oh, thanks very much." Cracknell appeared to find the prospect less than satisfying. "We'll meet tomorrow anyway," Miss Trant comforted him. "We're co-defending in that long firm fraud down the Bailey." Cracknell sighed and accepted the crumb of comfort. They had now reached the doorway of our chambers in Equity Court. "I suppose I'd better go up and get the brief." I suppose you had. Looking carefully about her and seeing no one, in the doorway of our chambers, so she told me later over a confessional bottle of claret in Pomeroy's, Mrs. Erskine Brown Nee Trant kissed Ken Cracknell. It was a moderately lengthy kiss. Miss Trant at first closed her eyes, the better to savour the experience, but when she opened them she found herself looking up at the room occupied by the devoted Ken, and there she saw an unexpected sight. "Ken," she whispered, "isn't that the window of your room?" Yes, of course it is." Ken turned and looked up at what he now regarded as his room. The light was on in the early evening, and on the drawn blind could be seen the silhouette of a figure who has become, I flatter myself, pretty familiar around the Temple and the courts of law. It was the shape of a man not tall, but comfortably built. Claude Erskine Brown might say fat, wearing a bow tie and smoking a small cigar. "Oh, dear," said Miss Phillida Trant, staring at the clearly inhabited window. "What have I done? I only wrote him a letter." I had let myself into chambers that evening with the key I had never abandoned, and had gone straight up, the clerk's room being empty, to the room which I still considered to be mine. The eye was immediately assaulted by some luridly covered copies of a magazine entitled Schoolgirl Capers, in which the schoolgirls in question, none of whom could have been a day under 35, were wearing pigtails and abbreviated gym slips and getting up to no sort of good whatsoever. I lit a small cigar, undid the tape which secured the brief in the Simpson murder, and was standing by the window reading contentedly, delightedly conscious of the fact that there was no she who must be obeyed at home awaiting my return, when the door burst open and a dark-browed and fiercely scowling young man appeared to make me instantly unwelcome. "What on earth?" The young man started, but I interrupted him. "I don't think we've met, have we?" "No, we haven't. I'm Ken Cracknell." Of course, I should have remembered Miss Trant's letter giving me the lowdown on our new radical barrister. I don't know how it was that it slipped my memory, and I was tactless enough to say, "You're new in the clerk's room, aren't you, Ken? I hope Henry hasn't been caught with his fingers in the coffee money. Oh, by the way, I'm Horace Rumpole." "I'm not a clerk." For an egalitarian barrister with no side, Cracknell seemed immoderately outraged. "I'm a member of the bar. I was a squatter." "Oh, well, I hope you're not going to squat in here." I looked round my old room, fearful of an invasion of my privacy. "I was a squatter until they knew you were retiring for good," Cracknell told me. "Then they gave me a place in chambers. Your place, Rumpole. I share this room with Owen Glendower Owen." "They gave you my place?" I couldn't believe it. "Who gave you my place?" "The head of chambers. It's a squeeze in here for two. We certainly couldn't manage a third." "Guthrie Featherstone, QCMP, gave you my place?" I knew then how Julius Caesar felt when he saw his learned friend Brutus whip out the knife. "With the full support of a chambers meeting," Cracknell added, bringing in the full cast of conspirators. "That's my brief you're covering with your cigar ash. Regina versus Simpson. It's a murder." "A case where I gather from Miss Phillida Trant you are a little out of your depth. I came over to see if I couldn't help out a little on the question of blood." "Thank you." Cracknell didn't sound particularly grateful. "It's my first murder, and I intend to cope with it on my own." They were brave words, as even I had to recognize. I moved to young Cracknell and gave him an encouraging clap on the shoulder, at which he flinched visibly. "That's the spirit, Ken. What's your line of defense?" When I put the question, he looked at me with continued and blank hostility. The truth of the matter, of course, was that he hadn't worked out a defense at all. I didn't mean to take immediate advantage of this weakness. "We'll talk about it in the morning, shall we?" I said. "Two heads are always better than one." Then I picked up one of the magazines devoted to elderly schoolgirls. "Oh, I'd be obliged if you'd keep your private reading matter at home." "That's not my private reading matter." Cracknell appeared to be making an effort to speak and suppressing considerable rage. "Those are exhibits in an obscene publications case I've got up in the north of England. Grimble Crown Court, as it so happens." I put on my hat to leave him then, but I didn't go before I had congratulated him on an excellent start at the bar. "Obscenity, murder, you're leading an exciting life, aren't you, Ken, for one so young?" I moved to the door and smiled. "I'll speak to our head of chambers about you in the morning, see if he can't fix up a little annex for you somewhere." And before young Cracknell could explode, I was off to savour the pleasures of a solitary evening at Froxbury Mansions, many miles away from she who must be obeyed. The next morning, when I presented myself in the clerk's room, my appearance produced what I can only describe as a stunned and embarrassed silence. It It was not until I had gone upstairs to announce the glad news of my return to our learned head of chambers, Guthrie Featherstone, QCMP, that Henry recovered himself sufficiently to speak to the assembled company of Miss Trant, Ken Cracknell, and Uncle Tom. Mr. Featherstone wants to see him. He'll sort it out, I'm sure. Henry shelved the problem of Rumpole and then leafed through his diary to check on the future plans of the rest of his stable of hacks and thoroughbreds. He asked Cracknell how long he gave the long firm fraud he was starting that morning, working in double harness with Miss Phillida Trant. "At least 4 weeks," Cracknell said with satisfaction, and Miss Trant nodded. She was also thinking of the fine pile of refreshers. Henry shook his head doubtfully. "I'm afraid it's going to clash with your obscenity up north," he said. "We'll have to return the brief, and then there's the murder coming up." "You'll be getting awfully rich for a radical barrister." Miss Trant smiled at Cracknell in a proud and almost proprietorial way. "I can't leave the fraud, Henry." Ken Cracknell was clear where his duty lay. "So I may have to give up the dirty books. Come on, Phillida. Time we got down to the Bailey." As the growing friendship between Phillida and Ken led them down Fleet Street together, Featherstone was awkwardly explaining to me, "You see, Rumpole, your coming back would rather rock the boat of Chambers." I wasn't sure I liked the drift of his argument. "It would," I said. "What do you mean it would? I am back." Featherstone cleared his throat, I'm glad to say in some embarrassment. "Since your departure, we've taken on 2 new members. We reckoned you were worth at least 2 other barristers, so we put 2 in your room. Glendower Owen has joined us from Cardiff, and young Ken Cracknell. I've met Cracknell," I assured him. "He's got himself a nice little murder. I might just be able to help him." "Ken's got your room, Rumpole." Featherstone was becoming more determined, no doubt in desperation. "Are you trying to tell me, Featherstone, in your devious and political kind of way, that there is no room for Rumpole at the inn?" "I'm afraid, Horace, that's exactly it." Featherstone's gloom was impenetrable. I took a long pause and then said cheerfully, "I know exactly what I shall do. Go back to Florida." The good Guthrie seemed to see a glimpse of light at the end of the tunnel. "Of course you should. I'm sure we all envy you the sunshine, wish you many long and happy years in your retirement." But I interrupted him in a way that clearly dashed his fragile hopes. "Go back to Florida? Certainly not. I'm going to give up being an orange." I moved to the door and then turned back to smile at Featherstone. "I shall squat." It was all very well. I had made my position clear. I was a squatter, and I intended to squat, but as I contemplated empty days ahead, stuck with the Times crossword and always in the way, I have to confess that the first fine burst of excitement which had sent me winging over the Atlantic began to dry to a mere dribble. And then a miracle of sorts happened. As I pushed open the door of the clerk's room, Henry was on the telephone. As I loitered, lighting a small cigar, I distinctly heard him say, "Is that Grimble 43021? Austin, Swink and Pardner? Could I speak to Mr. Handyside, please?" Henry was on the phone to Albert Handyside. Albert had been my old clerk, but had left us after what I felt to be a quite unnecessary inquiry into his management of the petty cash by that infernal busybody Claude Erskine Brown. Albert had then crossed the Great Divide and gone to work as a solicitor's clerk in a grey and wind-blasted town called Grimble in the north of England. "Oh, Albert," Henry had got through to his great predecessor, whom he was addressing in a somewhat patronizing manner. "This is Henry. Yes, our boy, Henry. Mr. Cracknell's clerk. It's about our obscenity up north in your neck of the woods. I'm afraid Mr. Cracknell's tied up at the Old Bailey for the next 2 weeks. Miss Trant's in the case with him. Or Mr. Glendower Owen? Oh, he's doing a long rape in Swansea. I'm terribly sorry I can't oblige you. It just isn't anyone in chambers. No one in chambers, Henry? I said loudly, and when he didn't move, increased the decibels. A moment of your valuable time, Henry. Oh, yes, Mr. Rumpole, what is it? Henry said testily as he covered the mouthpiece with his hand. I'm just on a telephone. On the telephone to old Albert Handyside, who used to be my head clerk when you didn't know Bloomsbury County Court from London Sessions, I reminded him. Put him through to me, will you, Henry? I'll be glad of a word or two with old Albert. I'll be in my room. And I made for the door so that I could speak in private to my old clerk. You'll be in Mr. Cracknell's room? Henry asked, and I put him right quite firmly. No, Henry, I'll be in my room. Mr. Rumpole, good to hear your voice, sir. I thought you'd retired. Good to hear your voice, Albert. Retired? No, whatever gave you that idea? Well, Mr. Rumpole, I don't know. And I'm delighted I cut him off before he could become even more doubtful. Really delighted we're doing this little obscenity case together in the north of England. Have a bit of fun, quite like old times, eh, Albert? You're doing it, Mr. Rumpole? Albert sounded puzzled and not quite as overjoyed as I'd anticipated. Oh, yes, didn't Henry tell you? I expect it slipped his mind. You see, there's no one else to do it. Ken Cracknell's so terribly busy these days. Oh, perhaps I'd better have a word with your clerk again, sir. Oh, I'd be glad to have you up here again. Yes, of course. I'll put you back to Henry. I then jiggled the instrument, and when I heard Henry's distracted voice, I told him that Albert Handyside wanted a word with him, and that it was quite like old times. Then I replaced the receiver and relaxed with a sense of something accomplished, something done. As I sat back in my old chair, creaking, swivelling, and leaking stuffing, I glanced across at that magnet which had drawn me across the Atlantic, the brief in which Regina versus Simpson, the Notting Hill Gate underground stabbing, labelled by some oversight of fate, Mr. K. Cracknell. I heaved myself to my feet, went over to it, and slid off the tape. The first thing I saw was a coloured photostat of the sheet of paper with the letters said to have been scrawled in the victim's blood. What interested me now was the message. It was the first time I'd read it. It was short but somewhat obscure, scrawled but possible to read, and it ran, "Sunlight to children of the sun, blood to children of the dark." Well, now I realized why fate and Gaelic Airlines and Miss Trant's letter had all combined to bring me winging back to England. I was the only member of Chambers with a chance of helping the unfortunate Simpson. I had the knowledge, and I must be careful how I handled it in acquiring my next notable British trial. The next evening at Froxbury Mansions, I was pushing my eyes over Schoolgirl Capers, Volume 1, Numbers 1 to 6, which it was my tiresome duty to go through before enjoying the treat of an obscenity trial at the Grimble Crown Court. I also had to read 2 remarkably dull works of fiction entitled Double Dating in the Tower of Terror and Manacle Me, Darling, but I kept these back as the main stodge, and as I was flicking through Schoolgirl Capers Volume 1, Number 4, by way of an hors d'oeuvre, all the other items of suspect material being in my briefcase, which was open on the floor beside me. Also open on the floor beside me, as I come to remember it, was a half-full, you can tell that I was feeling sufficiently comfortable and optimistic, not to say half-empty, bottle of Pomeroy's Plonk, which I found left a more pleasant afterglow than the perfectly acceptable Californian Chateau Wells Fargo, or whatever it was that I had grown used to drinking. I must say it was my second bottle of Pomeroy's Ordinary, and I was stretched out on the sofa, cushions under the head, jacket and shoes off, and the open waistcoat deep in the snow of cigar ash. A saucer of small cigar ends was also on the floor beside me. In the kitchen, relics of my various meals. I went in for a regular diet of boiled eggs and toast. I don't aspire to haute cuisine. I covered the table and comfortably filled the sink. Before my eyes, the middle-aged schoolgirls capered, lifting their tunics, sticking out their tongues, and gyrating in a lethargic, half-gymnastic sort of way, which I found singularly asexual. Had I not known it to be impossible, I might have thought I heard the sound of a key in the front door of the mansion flat. I went on reading. Rumpole! But this was no dream. I distinctly heard the front door open and a clarion cry with which I was all too familiar. I sprang into activity. My long training in crime stood me in excellent stead, and I started to remove clues and reorganize the scene. The saucer of cigar ends was tipped into the wastepaper basket. The bottles and glasses went on the windowsill, where they might be concealed by the curtain until I got up at dawn. I fastened my briefcase on the sexually explicit material and... Rumpole, I know perfectly well you're there. It was a familiar voice. I looked round for incriminating signs and saw Schoolgirl Capers, Volume 1, Number 4, on the sofa. It was the work of seconds by a determined man able to keep his head in an emergency to thrust it behind the sofa cushions. I then took a deep breath, regretted I hadn't finished the second bottle of Plonk for courage, and threw open the door that opened into our entrance hall, or vestibule. "What have you been doing, Rumpole? Trying to lie doggo?" She who must be obeyed was standing there surrounded by suitcases. Hers, I knew with a sinking heart, was to be no fleeting visit. "What's at the bottom of this, Rumpole?" What's at, where?" "What's at the bottom of your extraordinary behaviour?" "I shall find out." "Don't think I shan't find out. You can't hide anything from me, Rumpole." For once I was at a loss for an answer. I shrugged vaguely, having not the faintest idea what she was on about. Then she decided to lift the pressure and rise for a short adjournment. "In the meantime," Hilda said, "you can go and put the kettle on. I think I'll have a cup of instant." "She who must be obeyed," I murmured, as I went obediently to the kitchen door. Later the next day, as I was having a conference with my client over the Grimble obscenity case, on the home front, she who must be obeyed paused in the much-needed hoovering of our living room to plump the sofa cushions. Under one of these cushions she discovered a strange, and to her eye deeply disturbing object. That is to say, a much-thumbed copy of Schoolgirl Capers, Volume 1, Number 4. She picked it up as though it were some unmentionable vermin that had crept into the warmth of our sofa and died, and holding it at arm's length, she leafed through the contents. She'd got to page 45 when she realized that a desperate remedy was needed. She wrapped the awful exhibit in a sheet of plain brown paper, put on her hat and coat, and went straight round to the surgery of our local GP, a somewhat dour and anxious Scot named Dr. Angus McClintock. "I had to come, Doctor," Hilda spoke in a voice of doom. "Something terribly strange has happened to my husband." "Terribly strange? Oh, dear me, not his back again?" "Worse than his back. I found this. He's been reading this." At which Hilda stripped off the discreet brown paper covering, and revealed Schoolgirl Capers, Volume 1, Number 4, in its full embarrassment, to the doctor's astonished gaze. "I'm very much afraid, Dr. McClintock," Hilda told him, "that Rumpole has got sex." The next day I travelled up north to put up in the majestic Hotel Grimble, and Ken Cracknell, Esquire, met his instructing solicitor, Mike Mowbray, and his client, Percival Simpson, at Brixton Prison. I have sinned. I appreciate that. What can I do? Simpson gave a watery smile. Mr. Simpson, who had the knife? Cracknell felt he had to take some sort of command, and came out with a pugnacious question. He gave me the knife, so I could kill myself. That's the cunning of them, you see, Simpson said patiently, but apparently without any real hope of being understood. You had the knife, Mr. Simpson. Now why did you use it? Why? Ken was cross-examining his client. Ever an unwise thing to do. You run the extreme risk of the old darling telling you he did the crime, which is hardly welcome information or helpful to the defense. At this point, Mowbray was sure that he saw their client casually smother a yawn. I'm so tired, Simpson admitted. Was it sex, Mr. Simpson? Had he come down there to make sexual advances? Were you trying to fight him off? Cracknell had, in his extreme lack of experience, hit on a somewhat trite defence. I must say that was the line that appealed to me, Mike Mowbray admitted, showing his prejudices. He was that sort of bloke, wasn't he? Eton and the Guards, that sort of character. Your Class A gay. I don't know what sort of person he was, but he was one of them, Simpson agreed. Well, exactly, Mike Mowbray was delighted. I can't say any more, really. Simpson stood up to end the meeting. I'm tired of fighting. Excuse me now, please. I can't say any more. So it was a despondent Cracknell and Mowbray, counsel and instructing solicitor, who made their way out past the Alsatians and the trusty prisoners weeding the dusty plants in the back flower beds under the prison walls. As they approached freedom and the gate, Mike comforted his friend. You'll pull off something, Ken, he said. You've always done that up to now. On my own? Ken sounded unexpectedly incredulous. Mike was puzzled. He knew his friend was an ambitious young barrister, who wouldn't want to share the limelight which would shine on him in an important murder. You don't want a silk, do you? He asked. Not a silk, no. Ken Cracknell was thoughtful. But perhaps a very experienced member of the junior bar to lead me. You know, Mike, if you've got to insult an aristocratic corpse, grey hair might be a help. An experienced junior? Mike thought the suggestion over. Like who? Got any ideas? Well, yes, Ken Cracknell said. I think I have. For some extraordinary reason, the Grimble case was a resounding defeat for the retired expatriate Rumpole. So it was in no light-hearted mood that I returned, travel-stained, British Railway bashed, and jury battered, to my refuge in Froxbury Mansions. I had expected, on recent form, a cold welcome from she who must be obeyed. Imagine my surprise, therefore, when I let myself into the flat and found in my living room lights dim, flowers bought and set in a cut-glass vase, and she reclining by the gas fire wearing some sort of dressing-gown. Our old wireless set was on, and from it the disembodied voice of the late Richard Tauber percolated. As I entered the unexpectedly warm gloaming of our living room, she said, Rumpole, is that you, dear? What did you call me? I couldn't believe my ears. I called you dear. Can't I call you dear, Rumpole? She rose gracefully and actually poured me a glassful of Pomeroy's Plock, and it was a liberal measure. Oh, I suppose there's no reason why not. I took a gulp and a sniff around. Isn't there a rather odd sort of smell in here? Is there? A distinctly unusual smell. Mixture of R.C. churches and old flower vases. Well, that's not very romantic. No. I'm wearing lavender water, Rumpole, Hilda said, almost coyly. The lavender water you give me every Christmas. Oh, sorry, I didn't recognize it. I realized I'd said the wrong thing and returned my nose to my glass.
"Since we met, you have given me 39 bottles of lavender water,"
Hilda said without rancour. "Well, I never knew what else you'd like the smell of." And then I confessed. The case at Grimble was an unmitigated disaster. Very unsatisfied client. I sat on the sofa and gratefully changed the subject. "I say, you got a cold or something? Been in bed, have you, Hilda?"
"What do you mean?"
"You're wearing a dressing gown." I thought it was about time someone pointed it out.
It's really more of a negligee."
And to my amazement, Hilda came and sat down quite uncomfortably close to me. In fact, she was squashing up against my knee as I scratched the old sore of my disastrous day in court. I made the mistake of appealing to the old English sense of freedom. Freedom's gone out of fashion in Grimble. Herr Tauber's voice had risen to a painful squeal. I put him out of his misery and switched him off. That singer appears to be in some sort of pain.
"That was these we have loved."
To my alarm, Hilda was squashing up against me even more.
"We're not too old, are we, Rumpole?" she almost whispered, "to enjoy anything sentimental?"
"No," I made a cautious admission, but... And then Hilda said a surprising thing.
"You don't have to read those magazines, Rumpole," she said. "After all, you are married."
"What magazines?" I wasn't entirely with her.
"A dreadful thing about schoolgirls. I found it behind the sofa cushions."
I began to get a strange glimmering, a sort of clue to Hilda's incalculable behaviour over the last days. "Good heavens," I told her, "I had to read that. Yes, it was part of the evidence in my case."
"Your what?"
Hilda seemed taken aback. "The obscenity case, the one I did at Grimble. Good God, Hilda, you don't think I enjoyed reading that rubbish, do you? I've never been so bored in my whole life."
"Bored?"
She sounded curiously disappointed.
"Is that what you wear?"
"Well, naturally. You didn't read it, did you?" My mind began to boggle at the thought of Hilda reading solemnly through changing-room orgies. However, she shook her head vigorously, got up quickly, and moved away from me. "No, of course not," she said. "Oh, was your work, was it? That's all it was." "Absolutely all," I assured her. She moved to the door and snapped on the centre light. Then she became brisk and businesslike as she emptied an ashtray and turned down the fire. I was back with the old familiar she who must be obeyed, and it was almost a relief. At least I knew where I was, and she was no longer squashing my knee. "Well, I've got to get on," said Hilda. "No use hanging about the living room all night chattering to you. I've got chops to get under the grill. You can start laying the table, Rumpole. You really might lend a hand occasionally." When she'd left the room, I saw that the tide had gone down in the bottle of Pomeroy's claret. I reached up to find a reserve bottle propping up the criminal appeal reports on the top of the shelf. "That sounds more like your old self, Hilda." "What did you say?" Hilda called from the kitchen. "Just getting another bottle off the shelf, Hilda," I said. Meanwhile, back in chambers, life was filled, as usual, with intrigue and, indeed, romance. Guthrie Featherstone, who had found the charms of our Portia, Miss Phillida Trant, increasingly irresistible, called on her in her room quite early one morning to find her boning up on the law of evidence preparatory to another day with her fraudsman. "You're not still in that dreary case down at the Old Bailey, are you?" Featherstone asked gallantly. "Yes, thank God, with some quite decent refreshers." "A pity." Featherstone moved stealthily nearer to Miss Trant's desk. "We might have had lunch tomorrow, taken a trip along to the Trattoria Galactica in the Fulham Road, you know. That's where all the BPs go." "The what?" Miss Trant was still deep in Phipson's law of evidence. "Beautiful people, like you, Miss Trant.
Won't you just let me take you to lunch there? I don't think so. Miss Trant turned the page. What would your wife, Marigold, have to say? I'm not exactly under her eagle eye at lunchtime. Featherstone sniffed appreciatively. What a super perfume you're wearing. Do you know Ma Tendresse? No, who's she? Oh, I say, enormously witty. Ha ha! Ma Tendresse. It's an absolutely super new perfume. Definitely exotic. You should try it. I might ask Claude, but he's not much of a one for buying perfume. No, that's the problem with barristers who get keen on commercial law. They lose their talent for giving perfume. Featherstone smiled, and then allowed his hand to fall casually on Miss Trant's shoulder as he approached the other object of his visit, secondary to the wooing, but still of importance. Oh, I say, Miss Trant, I think you should know. I thought we might take on a new young member of Chambers, apparently a brilliant cross-examiner. Oh, really? Miss Trant was still into Phipson, and appeared not to notice Guthrie's hand. Yes, I thought you might know her. Her name's Elizabeth Chandler. At which Miss Trant shut her book and stood, dislodging Guthrie's grasp, and said with marked disapproval, A woman? Probably, Featherstone conceded, if the name's Elizabeth Chandler. Oh, I don't think we want another woman in Chambers. Miss Trant was firm on the subject. You don't? How very interesting. Henry has to explain to solicitors about it being a woman he's sending down to the indecent assault. He often gets objections. Even Featherstone was surprised at the speed at which an ambitious woman can, in the legal profession, show signs of male chauvinistic piggery. But you, Miss Trant, you're doing so marvellously well. He smiled at her ingratiatingly. Well, I do flatter myself I've been accepted, but I don't think we need another woman. Featherstone was not displeased with this objection, seeing in it the chance of another meeting. Why don't we have a long chat, Miss Trant, as to exactly what we do need? And I'd like to discuss your life in the law. Old Keith was telling me the Lord Chancellor's office has definitely got its eye on you. On me? You must be joking. Miss Trant looked at her head of chambers somewhat more kindly. Oh, no, Miss Trant, Featherstone assured her. I'm not joking at all. Shall we say next Tuesday at the Trattoria Galactica, among the beautiful people? The truth of the matter was that not only did Miss Trant feel that her distinguished position as the only woman in the all-male enclave at Equity Court was threatened, but she was particularly reluctant to admit Miss Elizabeth Chandler, a very warm-hearted blonde who, though horsey, got sent boxes of chocolates by judges, and conducted her cases with a beguiling mixture of pure law and smouldering sexuality, which was quite a match for Miss Trant's courtroom performance. Miss Trant had also, during the time it took him to graduate from squatter to tenant, conceived something of an uncontrollable passion for Ken Cracknell, and she wasn't going to have Miss Chandler luring her impressionable young radical off to points and hunt balls and other such sinks of iniquity at the weekends. She raised the matter with Cracknell as they walked together down Fleet Street towards the Old Bailey. I don't know what Guthrie Featherstone thinks he's up to. I mean, we're packed like sardines in Chambers as it is. We certainly are. Ken was sunk in moody and sullen thought. Then he said, You did tell me Rumpole left the bar because he was losing all his cases. In front of Bullingham, yes. It depressed him dreadfully. Oh, but I think it was just a run of bad luck. It was bound to end sometime. But he lost his nerve. Yes, and might lose it again. I mean, if he comes any more croppers. I know. Miss Trant looked at him with sympathy. He lost your dirty books case in the north. I think that's shaken him, too. How much more do you think it'd shake him if he lost a really big one? Cracknell asked thoughtfully. Well, badly. They crossed the traffic and walked past the Black Marias and taxis loaded with dubious company directors converging on the Old Bailey. But about this ridiculous idea of Featherstone's, I really think I'll have lunch. and talk him out of it. So Miss Trant rattled on about her fears and indignation, but Ken Cracknell was hardly listening to her, his mind being on something else entirely. Next day I pushed open the door of the common room, and found it to be fully inhabited and stinking of some foul tobacco that Ken Cracknell rolled himself, to show his solidarity with the working man. Ken was sitting at the desk, and Glendower Owen filled the armchair with himself and a large brief. I had rather avoided a confrontation with Ken Cracknell since the Grimble debacle, but now that it could no longer be avoided, I decided that the only way was to come clean, confess that I had been got, banged to rights, and hope for a conditional discharge. "Oh, Ken," I greeted him. "Do you mind if I call you Cracknell? I'm afraid I didn't do too well up in Grimble." Henry told me." Cracknell leant back in my swivel chair and put his feet firmly on my desk. "Dissatisfied client, I'm sorry to say." "Yes." Cracknell glowered at me, and then, quite unexpectedly, he smiled. "Well, I don't expect it was your fault." The small Celtic person giggled from my armchair. "It seems Rumpole spouted Wordsworth at the jury. It went down like a lead balloon. Hee." "I found the result a little disappointing," I confessed. "There'll be other cases." To my amazement, I got the distinct feeling that Ken Cracknell was trying to cheer me up. "I was thinking of asking you to lead me in my murder," Cracknell said casually, blowing out a cloud of instant bronchitis. "You? Me?" For once in my life I was incoherent. Cracknell, from now on I shall call him Ken, went to my mantelpiece, took down the coveted brief in Regina versus Simpson. "I feel," said the dear boy, "that you're absolutely right for this." I didn't dispute it. It was a case which I always knew should have been mine. I mean, I don't want some smooth leader like Guthrie Featherstone who'll twist Simpson's arm and make him plead guilty. "Plead guilty?" I almost exploded. "I never plead guilty." At which I grasped the proffered brief before Ken had any chance of changing his mind. "It's not an easy case, Rumpole." Ken looked genuinely worried, bless his heart. "I really don't know what the answer is." "Worry not, old darling, my dear Ken. Your days of anxiety are over. The answer lies in the blood. I had a murder. I even had a suspected carrying of housebreaking implements by night. It's true that after our singular evening with Richard Tauber, a certain amount of cold air had been blowing between myself and she who must be obeyed. I didn't feel I was forgiven for the sudden dash to freedom, nor was it likely to be forgotten in a hurry. As a consequence, there was a good deal of silence about the matrimonial home, broken from time to time only by the clicking of Hilda's tongue. Once outside the confines of Froxbury Mansions, however, my spirits rose, my step was lighter, and I could be heard to hum tunelessly as I emerged from the Temple Tube station with the light of approaching battle in my eye. God was in his heaven, and I had the brief in Regina versus Simpson, and so there was nothing much wrong with the world outside Froxbury Mansions. It was, therefore, with a feeling of exhilaration and excitement that I returned to that favourite rendezvous of mine, the interview rooms at Brixton Prison. Ken had made his own way, and young Mowbray had walked down from his nearby office. However, a few minutes with our client Percival Simpson served to lower my spirits. He sat very quiet in his grey clothes, staring through the glass partition at the Screw's collection of cactus plants, and he seemed so utterly uninterested in the work at hand, so entirely resigned to his defeat and eventual conviction, that it was, I must confess, a little disappointing. "It's a miracle," he said at the outset, and seemed to find the thought depressing. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, Mr. Simpson. It may seem miraculous to you," I started modestly. "What?" Simpson turned to me then, but without any particular interest. "No, about the blood." Simpson didn't seem to be following me. That must be a miracle. If you have one fault, Mr. Simpson, I told him reluctantly, it is that you are a touch too ready to assume the miraculous. I can't fight it. He shook his head in resignation. Oh, yes, Mr. Simpson, you can fight it, and you will fight it. It was going to be an uphill task putting a little spirit into this Simpson. You're going to ask me what happened in the tube station? He sounded anxious. Am I? I can't tell you about that. They'd never let me go if I told you that. They can work miracles, you see. They always told me they could. They, Mr. Simpson? I was beginning to lose his drift. Who are they? I can't say. I really can't say. This time he shook his head and spoke with considerable decision. Never mind, all in good time. I'm sure you'll be able to. I thought it best to gain his confidence by starting as far as possible from the unfortunate incident on the underground station. I was going to ask you a little about yourself. You work, don't you, in the office of the Inspector of Taxes, Bayswater Division? Yes. Simpson seemed this time, perhaps understandably, reluctant to admit it. Well, that's not a criminal offence, I reassured him, although it'll hardly endear you to the jury. I've always been good at figures, since I was a child. Figures hold no mystery for me. Keen on your work, are you? As a constant victim of the Revenue's little brown envelopes, I found it hard to restrain a shudder. Oh, very keen. Simpson began to look almost lively. Every Thursday evening after work I go to evening classes in advanced accountancy. I glanced at the brief, checked the day of the murder. You went regularly to your evening classes by tube? Well, I can't afford to run a car, Mr. Rumpole. Simpson continued to react almost like a living being. Oh, what about supper? What? What about your supper when you went to evening classes? Oh, I'd always buy a takeaway chicken, and then I'd take a tube onto my bedsit. In Alexander Hertzen Road? Yes. And that was your regular routine on Thursdays? Yes, it was. It was important information, which I filed away in the back of my mind. But I was getting uncomfortably near the incident which I knew would sting Simpson to silence. So I asked a safer question. Who'll talk about your good character? Friends at work? Oh, I don't know many people. They call me the Duchess in the Inland Revenue. They what? It's a bit of a joke on my name, I suppose. Mrs. Simpson, you see, the Duchess. I suppose it's a bit of a funny joke. Oh, I see. Richly entertaining. I smiled obligingly. You've always been in the tax-gathering business? Since I left school at 16. I came in as tea-boy in the pay-as-you-earn. Now I'm number 2 accountant in the Schedule D. A meteoric rise. And your spare time, holidays, all that sort of thing. Spare time? Well, it's television, and I bring work home. Speaking as a taxpayer, Mr. Simpson, Duchess, couldn't you manage to be a little less dedicated to your calling? I said hopefully, and when he didn't answer, I asked, what about holidays? Holidays? I used to stay with my mother in Worthing until she was gathered. I managed to look suitably sympathetic, and then Simpson said, Only this year I managed a holiday abroad. I went to the Sunshine on a package. Sunshine? I tried to keep the renewed hope and excitement out of my voice and said as casually as possible, Not the Sunshine State, Duchess. That's not where they sent you on a package. Yes, of course, Florida. Simpson seemed to be losing interest again. Florida, of course. You took your annual leave in Florida. Just when did that happen, Duchess? Just when and where did it happen? Simpson didn't answer me, but he shook his head. All right, you can tell me later, I reassured him. And then I stubbed out my small cigar and stood. I said the words I remembered. We shall meet and talk, friend and brother, as sure as the seed grows in the sunlight. We shall meet and talk. The effect was extraordinary. Simpson looked straight at me. His voice seemed forced, and his eyes were full of fear. "They sent you. They sent you to betray me." "Of course they didn't. Do get your mind off miracles, Mr. Simpson. I told you." I was tying up my brief with its pink tape. "I came on a see-the-world budget special of Gaelic Airlines. I came entirely of my own accord." Simpson didn't look reassured, but I thought there was nothing more I could say to convince him at that moment, and that I had learnt all that he was prepared to tell me. There was only one thing to do now in the defence of Percival Simpson, and that was to telephone my son Nick on the other side of the Atlantic. "Dad! Yes, of course it's me. No, I'm not at work, because it's 4 o'clock in the morning." "Well, no, I haven't had your letter." I suppose I should have had more consideration. "Street corner," Nick was saying. "What street? Handing out leaflets and flowers?" Yes, of course I'll try it." "Oh, it's all in your letter, is it?" "Well, anyway, you sound happy." Yes. Love to Mum." As Nick put down the phone, Erica asked him in some dread, "He doesn't want to come back here, does he?" "No," said my son. He sounded puzzled. "No, he wants me to find Tiffany Jones." My Nick is a good lad, and indulgent to the whims of his no doubt trying father. Accordingly, he was to be found when the academic day finally began in a corner of the tree-lined, bicycle-ridden campus, having a quiet talk with Paul Gilpin from the English department. "That last day you saw Tiffany, Paul, did you notice anything unusual about her?" "Well, how do you mean, unusual?" "She wasn't ill or anything?" "No, she seemed well, happier than ever. Only one thing, I noticed she'd cut her arm. She was wearing a Band-Aid. I did ask her about it, but she wouldn't tell me." "You don't think it was a rusty needle?" Nick had had many unhappy examples of this among his students. "Oh, come on, Nick. You know Tiffany wasn't like that." "And you haven't heard from her since, then?" "Not a single word." Paul Gilpin was depressed, as anyone would be who was suddenly and mysteriously deprived of a life with a girl like Tiffany Jones. "She never left a note, no message, not a thing. It's worrying for you." "I went mad to start with. Rang around the hospitals and the police, of course. But at least I know she's alive." "How do you know?" "Someone came round for things." "They did?" "Oh, didn't I tell you? About 3 weeks ago, I guess. A guy called and said Tiffany wanted her things." "Well, who was he?" "Pretty young, in his 20s, I guess. Nice-looking boy, nothing you'd notice. Clean jeans and a clean white shirt, that sort of style, you know." "He didn't tell you his name?" "Didn't tell me a damn thing. Said he had strict instructions not to answer questions. Instructions from Tiffany, I guess. I found that pretty hurtful. Also, I thought it was a little strange, the things she wanted." "Well, what did she want?" "Well, certainly not clothes, makeup, none of the things you'd think a girl might need. He just took her books on maths, slide rule, pocket calculator, just the things she used for work and statistics and economy forecasts. The tools of her trade, Exactly that." Whilst Nick was pursuing his researches into the strange disappearance of Tiffany Jones, Miss Trant kept her luncheon appointment with our somewhat flustered and overexcited head of chambers, Guthrie Featherstone, in the Trattoria Galactica in the Fulham Road. I owe the following account of this meeting to her subsequent description of it to me over a glass of Pomeroy's Plonk. Featherstone was wearing a new silk tie and had obviously been waiting some considerable time. He was nervously snapping breadsticks between his fingers when Miss Trant arrived, the regulation 15 minutes late. As she sat down, she noticed a brimming Campari soda and a gift-wrapped package by her plate. Gulping the one and tearing at the sellotape with inquisitive fingernails at the other, she asked, "Is this for me?" "I bought it for you, yes," Featherstone admitted. "What an enormous bottle!" Miss Trant had succeeded in unshrouding what seemed to be a pint or two of ma tendresse. Well, it's only the toilet water, I'm afraid. I mean, who wants to spend 20 pines on a bottle of the perfume? I mean, when you can get so much more. With the toilet water. Featherstone was struggling ill-advisedly with the economics of this situation. Exactly. Well, I'll slosh it around, Miss Trant said cheerfully. It'll probably absolutely slay them down at the London sessions. I bought it for you especially. March Andres from Harrods. Claude won't mind you wearing it. Oh, Claude's not terribly into perfume, Miss Trant admitted, and then went into the subject which was uppermost in her mind. Now, about the girl you're thinking of taking into chambers. But Featherstone's mind was on other things. Marriage, he said. Funny thing about marriage. Marigold and I, we have our different interests. Marigold's taken up choral singing. They're doing the St. Matthew Passion. Oh, yes. And what passion are you doing, Featherstone? Miss Trant looked at her host with some suspicion.
Featherstone, thinking he was being treated like a dangerous Don Juan, was flattered. I say, you are sharp, aren't you? But look here, Phyllis. Do call me Guthrie. Phillida. What? My name's Phillida. You see, I've been making inquiries about this Elizabeth Chandler person, and I'm not at all sure she's the type that would really muck in at chambers. Also, there are only a certain amount of matrimonial disputes where solicitors want women. I mean, are there enough for two? Matrimonial disputes, Featherstone said gloomily. Well, there are quite enough of those, God knows. But Marigold and I, we just face facts. What facts? Miss Trant asked, without interest. Well, we may fancy other people, and, well, other people might fancy us. Might they? Miss Trant's neutral tones didn't betray her incredulity. We only stick together, of course, for the sake of the children. Oh, I hadn't heard about the children. Oh, hadn't you really? Featherstone suddenly became a great deal more relaxed. They had got onto a subject on which he felt thoroughly at home. Well, there's Arabella. She goes to this funny little school in Kensington. I mean, she's 8, but she's already got this extraordinary talent for dancing. And little Luke, well, he's only just 3. I've got him down from Marlborough. I imagine he might want to come to the bar some day. Oh, you don't want to fill the chambers up with Elizabeth Chandler, then? Miss Trant was quite uncertain as to whether she'd scored a victory. Look, if you've never actually seen the children, I just happen to have a couple of photographs about me. Only snaps, of course. We took them in Portofino last long vacation. It wasn't frightfully sunny weather. There, that's Bella on the terrace of our hotel. Featherstone had produced his wallet, from which he proudly drew a number of creased and faded snaps from the space between his credit cards and his cheque-book. What's she doing? Said Miss Trant, giving a cursory look. The Dying Swan? Oh, yes, said Featherstone proudly. Quite the little Margot Fontaine, isn't she? And this is old Luke with his fingers in the spaghetti. Ha ha! Oh, my God! Featherstone's voice had sunk to a hoarse whisper. He was staring across the restaurant at a couple of dark-suited businessmen who were about to settle at a distant table. What on earth's the matter? Asked Miss Trant, puzzled. My God, my God! Featherstone moaned quietly, his hand to his chest. Featherstone! Guthrie! You in some sort of pain? Miss Trant was no Florence Nightingale, and hoped to God she wouldn't be called on to administer the kiss of life. Pain, yes, pain, that's what I mean, of course. I must dash immediately. Look, I'll pay the bill. At which Featherstone stood up suddenly and pushed back his chair. Pay the bill? We haven't eaten anything, Miss Trant pointed out reasonably. But Featherstone was on his way out of the Trattoria Galactica, waving a limp hand and muttering vaguely, Goodbye, Phillida. See you in chambers sometime. This highly unsatisfactory luncheon had an immediate effect which unexpectedly involved me, and in a most unwelcome manner. As I wandered into the clerk's room, Henry told me that there was a lady waiting for me upstairs. As I opened the door, I noticed a welcome absence of Ken and Glendower Owen, and the unlikely presence of a handsome woman about 35 years of age, with a cashmere twin set, a double row of pearls, and an expression of grim determination. Mr. Rumpole, we have met over the years at Chambers parties. I'm Marigold Featherstone. I remembered the wife of the QC MP, our head of Chambers. Of course. Look, I'll just see if Guthrie's in his room. I don't want Guthrie at this particular moment. I thought the tone was somewhat chilling. Thank you very much. It's you I want, Mr. Rumpole. Would you mind closing the door? Hers was a tone of command. I shut the door behind me. You want me, Mrs. Featherstone? Tell me, Mr. Rumpole, do you handle divorce? Oh, only rarely, and then with particularly thick gloves. Why do you ask? I sat down at my desk. I ask, Mr. Rumpole, because I have need of your services. Of mine? For a divorce? Well, I mean, who... I thought perhaps she had a lady friend tossed on the rough seas of a stormy marriage, but her answer set me rocking back in the swivel chair. My husband, Mr. Rumpole. I'd hardly be bothering to divorce anyone else's husband, would I? I could see the force of her argument. She continued with her evidence. I was in the perfume department of Harrods, Mr. Rumpole. I was buying my usual little atomizer. Guthrie never brings me perfume home, and I happened to catch sight of him at the Ma Tendresse counter. He was buying perfume, I hazarded a guess. Well, Mr. Rumpole, he wasn't buying potatoes. I did my best to sound unconvinced by the evidence. Well, I don't see that adds up to much of a case. He might have been buying scent for anyone, an old aunt, perhaps. Has he got an old auntie with a birthday? He was buying it, Mr. Rumpole, said Marigold, driving the final nail into her husband's coffin, for the girl he took out to lunch at the Trattoria Galactica. My brother Tom was lunching his accountant there, and he distinctly saw Guthrie at the corner table gazing into the eyes of this King's Road strumpet. And do you know what Tom saw plonked on her plate? Tagliatelle Verdi? I was guessing again, of course. A big bottle of Ma Tendresse, the toilet water, of course. The wretched Featherstone clearly needed the assistance of a good lawyer. Always ready to take on a hopeless case, I decided to defend him. Mrs. Featherstone, if I were to act for you in this dispute with your husband, I started cautiously. Yes, said Marigold eagerly. The head of Chambers? Well, it would cause enormous embarrassment. If I'm divorcing Guthrie, Mr. Rumpole, embarrassment is just what I intend to cause. This was not a woman to be trifled with. I said, leave it with me, Mrs. Featherstone. I'll think it over. A bit of delay, I had found it an infallible rule, never does any harm to the defence. I shall call on you next week, said Marigold Featherstone coldly. Then I shall expect your answer. Whilst I set about the unlikely task of finding a defence to the charges brought by this implacable plaintiff against our head of Chambers, my son Nick, out of the extreme goodness of his heart, was finding out some other answers for me. He climbed into his rather battered Volkswagen — Erica kept the estate car for her use — and drove down to the Miami shopping street, where I had been buying small cigars when I first heard about seeds growing in the sunlight. Nick parked his car and walked up and down the street, but drew a blank. Then he went into a bar and ordered cold beer. He saw two girls in white dresses come into the bar, carrying long-stemmed chrysanthemums. Nick looked as he told me, and saw the young man in the white shirt and tie standing at the street corner with the flowers which he handed out to the passers-by, all of whom received them and his greetings with politeness and some with interest. In a moment Nick had abandoned his beer and was standing in front of the young man who had just presented him with the chrysanthemum. "It's a sunshine day," said the young man cheerfully. "Oh, is it? I really hadn't noticed," Nick said with carefully affected gloom. "Sunlight to children of sun," said the young man. "Are you not aware of the sun, our source of strength?" "I guess I'm only aware of my problems. I've sure got a few of those." Nick was giving an excellent performance of a young American academic going through a crisis in his personal relationships. "Meet and talk." The young man was smiling and interested. "Meet and talk?" Nick looked up gratefully. "The dark world's a maze. In the sunlight all is made clear. You make your life with us, and no more problems. That I guarantee. Will you come to us?" William was still smiling at Nick and looking at him through clear blue eyes with irresistible sincerity. "If only I could." "Of course you can. Anyone can. Knock, and it shall be opened to you." "What shall be opened?" "Home. Our home and your home. The Sun Valley that's waiting for you. All we ask is your talent." "What's your talent, Nicholas?" "Me? Oh, I'm a teacher. We need teachers. Teachers will help us educate the world in happiness and positive thinking." "What else do you need?" "All sorts. Builders, carpenters, cooks, doctors, economists." Nick made an informed guess based on the letter from me that he had by now received. "We have the best. We had a bad experience in that department, but now we have the very best. One of our most zealous children." "I wonder who—" Nick began to ask, but William gave him another welcoming smile and put a hand gently on his arm. "No more questions, Nicholas. I'm not questioning you about your life or whatever it is making you live in darkness. Come to us in sunshine. Save the questions until you're safe inside the family." "What's your work exactly?" Nick asked William. "My work, Nicholas, is to bring back friends." "Bring them back where?" "Home. You've got your car, haven't you? What are we waiting for?" So eventually they drove off in Nick's car, with William talking soothingly all the time, so that with the heat and the gentle voice repeating encouraging sentiments and messages of hope, Nick said that he felt in a way hypnotized and almost fell asleep as he drove along the freeway. They drove on for almost an hour, William giving directions and comfort, and my son Nick saying as little as was needed to keep up the pretense of his disillusionment with a harsh world and of his readiness to put his life at the service of an unknown master and join the children of the sun. "What do I have to do to get into your home?" Nick asked innocently. "Just decide to stay. Is that all?" "Well, if you do decide to stay with us, Nicholas, there is a contract." "Oh, a legal document?" "Scarcely. You will have to write out the words of power, and write them in rather a special way." "Oh, really? And what sort of a special way is that?" William turned to Nick for a moment and said quickly, "You write it in your own lifeblood, Nicholas. Everyone does. It doesn't take much to do it." At last they came to a high wall running along the side of a narrow country road, and then there was a wide gate in the wall, painted white and topped with barbed wire. Over the gate there was a high wooden arch and a sign reading "Sun Valley," and high and triumphant over the sign was a large glass-covered colored photograph of a cleric, a man with crinkly white hair, kindly eyes beaming behind rimless spectacles, and a deep and healthy suntan. Nick didn't recognize the photograph, but then he had never been in Percival Simpson's bed sit in Alexander Hertzen Road.
William asked Nick to stop in front of the gate, and he clasped his hands and raised them toward the photograph. "The master," he said. Then he asked Nick to honk the horn, and a couple of clean-shirted, large and healthy-looking young men came out of the shed by the gate and looked into the car. William rolled down the window and spoke to them. "A new friend and brother," he said. "His name's Nicholas." Nick said that the smiles of the gatekeepers seemed to be suddenly switched on like streetlights at twilight. "Be very welcome, Nicholas. May the sun shine always on a new friend." At which one of them unlocked the huge padlock which held the gate, and the other swung it open. "We're home, Nicholas," said William. "Just drive in slowly." Nick, bless his heart, drove in for the sake of the defence of Percival Simpson, and he said it was an extremely unpleasant moment when he heard the gates close and the padlock snap behind him. There was nothing immediately obvious that could explain the distinct sense of foreboding that my son Nicholas Rumpole felt. What he had driven into was like a spacious and very well-kept farmyard. There was a line of sheds where he guessed animals were kept, and another line of buildings on the other side of the square, which might have housed offices and communal rooms. The bottom of the square was also blocked by buildings of some sort, so that the compound was effectively closed in a way that made Nick think of a well-run open prison. The inhabitants, however, were all much like William, young men and women wearing clean jeans and smiling. In a corner of the yard, a group were loading boxes and sacks of vegetables onto a new pickup truck. As they worked, they were singing. "The sun's children," William said. "We're always singing." Strangely enough, Nick didn't find even this fact reassuring. At William's instructions, he drove across to the row of communal buildings. He parked, and they got out. William led him to what seemed to him to have been a converted cowshed, and opened a door. "This is the reception area, Nicholas. Wait in here. Be at peace, and I'll tell the office you've arrived to make you home with us." William left, and Nick found himself in a long room furnished with sofas and easy chairs. The walls were decorated with a number of bright but amateurish murals of young men and women and some children walking naked across a primitive landscape hand in hand. Almost the whole of an end wall was covered with a hugely blown-up photograph of the beaming cleric, whose picture hung over the gateway. Hymn tunes of a cheerful nature were being piped into the room by some mechanical music system. Nick went to the long windows and stood looking out into the yard. He saw the industrious young people loading the truck. He could see the guardians of the gate talking together by their shed. And then he saw another group of 3 or 4 son children come out of what may have been an office and set off toward the building at the end of the square. They were carrying ledgers and files, and walking a little behind them as though too tired to keep up. He saw Tiffany Jones. The door was unlocked, either by good luck or by William's forgetfulness. Nick was out of it in a moment, and standing in the sunshine, calling, "Tiffany!" "Nick, it's you. Have you come inside?" She stood there, a beautiful black girl with her arms full of files, half turned toward him, and he could hear the exhaustion in her voice, although it was denied by the bright and perpetual smile worn by all the children of the sun. "Tiffany, what are you doing? We all missed you. Paul's gone crazy looking for you." "I'm working, Nick. Working for the master." She looked round nervously and lowered her voice. "We're not supposed to talk. Not to outside people." "Working? What the hell are you working at?" "Oh, the books. Using my skill in figures. I work so hard, Nick." "Tiffany, tell me." Nick asked what I needed to know. "I can't tell you. The last guy they had for accounting, he was a traitor. He betrayed them, you see. That's why they needed me." "Well, who was he, Tiffany?" She didn't answer his question, and Nick looked round. One of the young men from the gate was coming towards them. "I can't stop. We'll meet and talk. Not one-to-one, however. We can only talk together, with all the children." On the other side of the square, the loading of the pickup truck was finished. The driver was climbing into his seat, and the crowd of loaders was moving away toward the large building at the end. The young man from the gate was moving towards Nick, calling out to him in a voice which had lost some degree of warmth. "Hey! Hey, you, friend, is that your car?" "Be welcome, Nick. Be very welcome," Tiffany said faintly. As she moved away from him, Nick was looking at the cardboard-covered file which was on top of those in the black girl's arms. There was a name written on the cover, which had been crossed out, the name Percival. "Drive that up to the carport with the other gifts," the young man instructed Nick in a voice that made it clear that it was less a request than an order. Nick looked to the open shed at which the young man was pointing, in which stood a number of new and not-so-new motor cars. Then he pulled his car door open. "Tiffany," he spoke to her as calmly as he could, "let me take you home." "Oh, don't be ridiculous, Nick." She was smiling at him, and at that moment her smile seemed particularly weary. "I am home." It was the last he saw of her. "Come on, friend, move, why don't you?" The young man from the gatehouse was not to be denied. Nick swung into the driving seat and saw through his dusty windscreen that the gate was open wide to let the truck full of vegetables out. He switched on his engine, put his foot flat on the floor, and gripped the steering wheel as his car shot forward. He reached the gate in a cloud of dust just as the truck was moving through it, and ignoring the shouts of the gatekeepers, he managed to get through in the truck's wake before the gate could close behind it. There was a space in front of the gate in which Nick could pass the truck, and then a long, narrow road between banks where he tried to get away from the truck, but it accelerated also and seemed near enough to touch his back bumper. Then the road twisted, and Nick saw the lumbering back of a slow-moving harvester in front of them. He twisted his wheel and, half-mounting the bank, managed to squeeze his little Volkswagen past the agricultural implement, leaving the vegetable truck stuck closely behind it. Nick didn't lift his foot from the floor when he reached the freeway. But though he watched the mirror, no one seemed to be giving him chase. He didn't feel safe, however, until he had parked in front of his house, got inside, and poured himself a long, cold glass of Californian white wine in the cause of freedom. He then lifted the telephone and put in a call to Equity Court in the Temple. "Splendid, Nick, absolutely splendid, my dear boy. I'm grateful. What a sad loss you are to the law." As I put down the instrument, I became aware of the presence of Guthrie Featherstone lurking by my desk. "Rumpole, I really think it's time I had a word." "That son of mine," I said in some elation, "is a chip off the old block, Featherstone. He's just done a splendid job on the Simpson murder case, an absolutely splendid job. Rumpole, I've been talking things over with Henry, and I've come to the conclusion that we've got an overflow problem in Chambers," he began. "I have to tell you, Rumpole, I don't honestly advise you coming back to the bar at your time of life. I just think you'll have to make other arrangements." I looked at Featherstone then with a sort of pity. The poor fellow had no idea of the gaping pit which was about to open at his feet. "You can't do it, old darling," I said. "You simply can't afford to lose me, Featherstone. You see, you absolutely rely on me to defend you, on a serious charge before a quite merciless tribunal." Really, Rumpole. And what tribunal are you talking about?" And then I told him about the serious charges laid against him, matters which his wife hadn't seen fit to mention in the privacy of their home, and the embarrassing divorce case she was planning. And as I was the only advocate with the smallest chance of winning him a verdict of not guilty, I pointed out, and he saw the force of the argument, that continued prattle about there being no room for Rumpole in Chambers was a foolish waste of time. Featherstone sat with his jaw dropped and a glassy look in his eye. He seemed to see the distant vision of Mr. Justice Featherstone in scarlet and ermine vanish before his eyes. "Rumpole, I rely on you." He looked at me in a beseeching sort of way. "I know."
But there is a quite innocent explanation. Featherstone was taking to the life of crime like a duck to the water. For you sitting in the restaurant with whoever it was, I asked. Does Marigold know who it was? He asked, with terror in his voice, seeing a scandal approaching which would involve the whole of Chambers. Not by name. She says she was a floozy, some little tart from the King's Road, I reassured him. Oh, Rumpole, Featherstone said in a voice of doom. It was Phillida. Can you possibly mean Miss Phillida Trant, LL.B., Honours of London University, member of this distinguished Chambers? I asked incredulously, turning the knife in the self-inflicted wound. Yes, Rumpole. I'm afraid that's exactly who it was. Then, if there is an innocent explanation, I put the situation before him in all its seriousness, you must let me come out with it. Otherwise, I don't give a toss for your chances, quite frankly. Of course, Rumpole, an entirely innocent explanation, Featherstone assured me somewhat desperately. I did my best to fill Featherstone with a sense of urgency. Your lady wife says she'll be back to speak to me. Oh, tell her, Rumpole. He was beseeching me now. She'll listen to you. I'm sure she'll listen. Meanwhile, my instructing solicitor, young Michael Mowbray, visited the village near to which the Honourable Rory Cantor had farmed almost 1,000 acres of rich and productive Hampshire countryside. Having taken a view of the property, Mowbray had a pint of beer and a plate of bread and cheese in the local pub, the Baptist's Head. There he heard that Fineacre Farm had been taken over by a foreign company, the exact nature of which was unknown to the red-faced, panting landlord, but which seemed to employ a workforce of young people who kept themselves a great deal to themselves and were an absolute dead loss as customers. He drove next to the neighbouring town and sought 5 minutes with the local solicitor, who happened to employ as London agents the firm where Mowbray had served his articles. He said he had a client and hinted at untold wealth and Arab connections, who was interested in buying the Fineacre property. The elder partner smiled, shook his head, and said he doubted very much if the present owners would sell. He himself had acted in the rather unusual transaction by which they had acquired the farm from Rory Cantor. From him, Mowbray was able to discover who these owners were, and when he passed the information on to me, I was more eager than ever for the date of the Simpson trial, and to pass on the facts I had collected to an Old Bailey jury. Before tackling the problems of Percival Simpson, I had Guthrie Featherstone's defence to take care of, and I was engaged on pleading his cause based on the new and ingenious set of instructions he had given me after our preliminary conference. As I opened the proceedings, I saw the tribunal looking distinctly frosty. It was as I had feared all along. Mrs. Marigold Featherstone was going to prove a hard nut to crack, and she was as unsmiling as a Methodist magistrate faced with a bad case of flashing in chapel. What should I say? Thank you very much, Guthrie, for messing about with the floozy. And on that charge I shall be able to demonstrate that Guthrie Featherstone, QC, MP, is entirely innocent, I assured the court. Innocent? The voice of Marigold Featherstone was the voice of scorn. Oh, yes. All men are innocent until they're proven guilty. I thought I'd better remind her of the proud principle of British justice. Mrs. Featherstone, when is your wedding anniversary? Next month, the 21st. Guthrie always forgets it. Well, this year he did not forget it. He remembered it most devotedly. He went into Harrods to buy you a large bottle of Mar Tendresse as a present for your wedding day. She thought this over, appeared to reflect, but then said with the first appearance of doubt, But Tom saw him in the restaurant. Purely circumstantial evidence, I assured her hastily, on which so many people have been wrongly convicted. You're not suggesting Tom was mistaken? The court was still hostile, though perhaps less determined. "Not in what he saw," I said reasonably, "but in the interpretation to be placed upon it. You see, Guthrie had just slipped into the trattoria, and he happened to see a lady, a member of the bar, as a matter of fact, waiting for a girlfriend. A member of the bar? Obviously, she hadn't even considered the possibility." "Oh, yes, Mrs. Featherstone. A profession open to all sorts and conditions of men and women. He sat down to chat with her about a case they were involved in. A long-firm fraud." "Fraud, indeed." Marigold was her old, scornful self. "And then he left her." I ignored the interruption. "Her friend never turned up, and she went shortly afterwards." "But they opened a parcel, a bottle of scent." I could see that the court was shaken. "Of course, he wanted her opinion as a woman rather than a lawyer on his choice of a present for you." "Oh, really? And why did he happen to slip into the Trattoria Galactica?" I allowed a long pause and then smiled and said softly, "Can't you guess?" "I certainly can't." It was time to play my last trump. If this didn't work, then nothing would. "He went in to book a table, of course. It is there he intends to take you out for a slap-up spread, Mrs. Featherstone, with champagne laid on regardless, to celebrate a decade of happy marriage on the 21st of next month." After the hard hour with Mrs. Featherstone, I went to meet Guthrie by arrangement in Pomeroy's wine bar, where he was waiting for me with considerable anxiety. In fact, he could hardly bring himself to ask, "Rumpole, how did it go?" "I think I can say, Featherstone, that it was touch and go until my final speech," I told him, after I'd settled down and forced him to buy a bottle of Pomeroy's best and most costly wine. "Oh, and Guthrie?" "Yes, Horace." Featherstone sounded more friendly than at any time since my return. "About my leaving Chambers." "Oh, well, that's not necessary, of course. Not," he added, still a little hopefully, "until you really want to retire." I was delighted that I had got the old fathead to see reason at last. "I mean," I said, "I must be here in case you need defending again. I seem to have got the ear of Mrs. Marigold Featherstone." "Oh, you have, Horace, indeed you have, and I'm most grateful for it." By and large, I was satisfied with my preparations for my leading role in the case of Regina versus Simpson. I had played my cards pretty close to my chest, and I hadn't taken my learned junior, Ken Cracknell, into my confidence about the nature of the defense. In spite of the distinct lack of cooperation from the client, I was in a high and even optimistic frame of mind when Henry said, and I thought I detected a new note of respect in his voice, "Your murder's in tomorrow, Mr. Rumpole. You've got a clean start at 10:30, court number 2 down the Old Bailey." Court number 2 wasn't court number 1. It was not the absolute centre, not quite the cream of Old Bailey courts, but number 2 was a large and impressive arena. It was ridiculous, but I felt I was at home. In all this excitement and drunk with nostalgia, I failed to ask my learned junior, Kenneth Cracknell, Esquire, who was the learned judge whom fate had selected to preside over the trial of the unhappy revenue official. When he told me, I felt a sinking stomach and rising nausea. My hands started to sweat, and I was breathing with difficulty. Home, I discovered with something akin to horror, was His Honor Judge Bullingham. So I drew Judge Bullingham for the 11th time of asking, and I had the horrible certainty that the old enemy would organize an 11th crushing defeat, which would make this much sought-after murder the absolute end of the line for Rumpole. If the gods really wish to destroy a person, I remembered, they grant his foolish requests. Had my feverish pursuit of the brief in Regina versus Simpson been no more than a final act of legal suicide? Filled with such unworthy fears, I kept my eyes to the ground as we all stood, and the bull charged into court. "Mr. Rumpole." The growl came, as usual, somewhere from the depths of the bull. "Do you appear for the defense?" When I realized quite clearly that the judge was just as displeased to see me as I was to be before him, my fear evaporated. I smiled charmingly and gave an inscrutable bow in which I hoped he might have been aware of some small element of mockery, at which the bull frowned and grunted unhappily. "Very well," he said, "let's get on with it. Mr. Colfax, if your lordship pleases." Morton Colfax, Q.C., leading counsel for the Crown, was a handsome ex-Guards officer, ex-Eton and New College, member of White's and the Beefsteak Club, and a bencher of his inn. He was a man I believed to be totally ignorant on the subject of blood. "The defence is represented," Colfax started quietly, "by my learned friends Mr. Horace Rumpole and Mr. Kenneth Cracknell. Members of the jury, this case concerns the knifing of a perfectly respectable citizen, a member of a well-known family, late one evening last January in the Notting Hill Gate Underground Station. It's a somewhat squalid story. My nerves were quite settled before I started to cross-examine the Crown's first witness, Mr. Byron MacDonald, the guard of the train that had been standing at the platform of Notting Hill Gate Station when the Honourable Rory Cantor came down the stairs. His evidence, as elicited in its full details by the prosecution, was in no way helpful to the defence. For a start, he made it clear that Cantor came down to the platform first, and was followed by Simpson, who clearly appeared to be the pursuer, whereas Cantor was obviously the victim. He saw, he said, Simpson come down, peer about him, and then move towards Cantor. They were then locked in the struggle, which he saw as his train moved away, a chain of events which, there was no possibility of dispute, ended shortly afterwards with the death of Cantor. Now I rose to question the tall Jamaican guard who stood in the witness box in his London transport uniform. He had been an excellent witness, and I started with the soft touch, the approach courteous, and the questions devious. "Mr. MacDonald," I began, "you say you saw the deceased, Mr. Cantor, come down to the platform first?" "Yes, Mr. Rumpole, he said that," the judge growled from his notebook. "And you saw my client, Mr. Simpson, come down afterwards?" I went on, ignoring the bull for the moment. "Following him, Rumpole. Your client was clearly the pursuer, going after his victim." "No, my lord, he didn't say following." I sounded patient, as if I only wanted to help the bull, and I picked up the notebook in which my junior had been writing down the evidence. "I have my learned friend Mr. Cracknell's note. The witness said he came down afterwards." "Well, if you think it makes the slightest difference." The bull snorted and practically winked at the jury, as though to say, "We don't, do we, ladies and gentlemen? We're far too bright to split hairs with the defending barrister. The difference it makes will become apparent by the end of this case, even to your lordship." I must say I was starting to lose my patience with the bull. He gave a warning growl of "Mr. Rumpole," but I moved rapidly on to the next question before he could give voice to his protest. "Mr. MacDonald, you did see Mr. Cantor move forward and speak to Mr. Simpson, my client?" "I think I did see that, yes." That was something, and at least the bull was quiet. I had another fact to establish. "And tell me, Mr. MacDonald, how long would it be before the next train arrived?" "I think about 5 minutes." "My last question. You never saw my client produce any sort of knife?" "No." "He never saw any knives at all, because his train left the station," Bullingham reminded the jury triumphantly. And then, as I sat down with my work on Mr. Byron MacDonald completed, the judge sighed with relief and asked Morton Colfax the name of his next witness.
Revere, my lord, Miss Diana Revere. If any members of the jury had found their attention wandering during my cross-examination of Byron MacDonald, they were clearly riveted by Miss Diana Smoky Revere. She came into the witness box wearing tight black leather, with her orange hair stuck out like the quills of a hedgehog. Her eyes were shadowed black, and her lipstick and fingernails a shade of mauve. She was chewing gum, and as she walked, she rattled like a spectre from the chain she wore round her neck. The bull looked at her with his eyes bulging as though years of whiskey had finally destroyed the last of his brain cells, and he was gently hallucinating. Miss Revere, were you going down Notting Hill Gate Underground Station on the night of Thursday, March the 13th? Yeah, with my friends. We was on our way to see the public execution at Watford. Do they still have those at Watford? The bull asked, and the jury laughed obediently. Nah, the public execution's a group, isn't it? Great sound, Diana explained patiently as though to a child. Morton Colfax, who had noticed that Smoky's evidence seemed to be fighting its way past some impediment, said, Miss Revere, are you eating something? Oh, sorry, my lord. Smoky smiled politely, removed her chewing gum with a slender finger, and stuck it under the ledge of the witness box. Morton Colfax waited patiently, then resumed his examination. Did you notice anything on the platform? Yeah, I saw the two geezers. What were the two men doing? Well, they were sat on the seat. And what happened then? Morton Colfax asked. Well, we all got into the train, didn't we? The boys was kicking a tin. They kicked it into the carriage. We saw the geezer with the carrier bag from the takeaway get in the carriage too. You saw Simpson? He sat down the other end on his own like. But it was the same carriage. Yeah. Miss Revere, let me ask you this. An important question was coming, and Morton Colfax brought himself to smile at the ornate girl in the witness box. Did you notice the man on the seat as your train was pulling out of the station? I saw him, yes, on a platform. I was looking out through the glass door, I reckon it was. I saw him topple over. He toppled over, Colfax repeated, and the jury were listening interestedly. Sort of sideways like, went all limp and boneless. Why do you think that was? The bull asked her. I thought maybe he was pissed or had a bit of the needle. You get a lot of those round Notting Hill Tube. You mean he was drunk? Morton Colfax translated. How did you guess? Miss Revere said, and the usher called silence before the jury could laugh. Did you happen to notice Mr. Simpson sitting at the end of your carriage? I just remember him. He was looking in his plastic bag like, and then I looked away and I think he dropped something into it. I don't know what it was. I heard it drop in, something heavy and metal, I think. What did he do then? He closed his eyes and leant back. It looked like he wanted to go to sleep. Thank you, Miss Revere, said Colfax, and sat down. The strange-looking girl and her dramatic evidence had a powerful effect on the jury. I rose to try to neutralize the damage. Miss Revere, when you got down to the platform, a train was just coming in? Yeah. So that it must have been about 5 minutes after the previous train left. Oh, I don't know about that. How can she know? The bull grumbled. Very well. Miss Revere, I don't suppose you noticed my client particularly at this time? No, not particularly, no. So you can't be certain about what you saw him do? I heard about the murder the next day. It came on the telly. Then I remembered what I'd seen. You say you saw my client close his eyes as though he were tired. He looked like it, yeah. You may know that it's a common reaction to be exhausted after you've made a violent attack.
Bullingham asked Smoky. He was absolutely ruthless. "I suppose so." Smoky looked suddenly bored, anxious to end her time in the witness box. "I had no reason to keep her there except to ask, and you may also know that people are frequently exhausted and in a state of violent shock after they have been attacked." "Yeah, I think so." "And you didn't see him writing at all?" I asked very loudly, and before the bull could get a word in edgeways. "You didn't see my client writing on any sort of scrap of paper?" "No, I didn't." "Thank you, Miss Revere," I said, and sat down and stared with mysterious triumph at the jury. After the excitement provided by Diana Smoky Revere, there came a dullish afternoon of agreed evidence, police photographers, map drawers, fingerprint experts, ambulance men, and the like. The first witness the next morning was the Honourable Rory Cantor's elder brother, Lord Freeth. He was a man in his early 40s, quite at his ease in the witness box, and he and Morton Colfax talked to each other as if they were members of the same club, which indeed they were. The learned judge listened obsequiously as though he were the slightly comic butler. The jury and the defence counsel were also allowed to overhear. "Lord Freeth," Morton Colfax allowed himself to touch an unpleasant subject. "Had your younger brother, to your knowledge, any homosexual tendencies?" "I can honestly say, my lord," Lord Freeth included the bull in the chat in a truly democratic manner, "that he had absolutely none." "Absolutely none." Bullingham wrote the words down obediently. "I think he was of a serious, indeed a religious disposition." "He was extremely religious, and, I am sure, sincerely so." "Your brother Roderick, I think," Colfax continued, "had a fiancée and was engaged to be married." "Oh, yes, they'd both dined with me that night at my club. There was absolutely none of the Oscar Wildes about Rory." "Thank you, Lord Freeth." Colfax sat down gracefully with every sign of satisfaction. I got a dirty look from the judge. "I suppose you've got some questions, Mr. Rumpole," he said. "Just a few." "Lord Freeth," I said, rising to my feet, "your club is where?" "In St. James's." "And after dinner, did Rory drive his fiancée home?" "To her flat in Chelsea," Lord Freeth agreed. "And he lived in Eaton Square?" "Eaton Place, actually." "Another address in southwest London?" "Yes." Lord Freeth frowned as if wondering where these questions were leading. "Have you any idea what he was doing northwest in Notting Hill Gate?" "No. As a matter of fact," Lord Freeth agreed, "I've wondered about that." I broached another subject. "You told us that your late brother was of a sincerely religious disposition." "He's told us that," the bull grumbled, and only just forgot to add, "Let's get on with it." "And you didn't entirely approve of his religious views, did you, Lord Freeth?" "I didn't approve of all he did, no," the witness answered carefully. "Had he made over his farm in Hampshire by way of a gift to the particular religious sect he favoured?" Lord Freeth hesitated, and then answered frankly. "He had. He was merely staying on as a manager." "Had he also given them a great deal of money?" "I believe he had." "All the money he inherited from your father?" "I think most of it." "And was his fiancée of the same religious persuasion?" "Yes, they'd met when Rory was in Florida, playing polo. I believe she converted him." "So he gave all he had to the poor?" "We have pretty good authority for that, Mr. Rumpole." Bullingham, that great man of religion, was looking wisely at the jury. and some of them even did me the disservice of nodding solemnly and assuming serious and devout expressions. When I asked my next rude question, it was a bit like belching in the church. Except that you thought he'd given all he had to the rich. You believed it was an extremely rich organization, didn't you, Lord Freeth? To my great relief, the witness seemed to agree with me. I thought perhaps they were exploiting Rory, he said, choosing his words with care. At the moment when it appeared that I was winning the witness over to my still obscure purposes, Morton Colfax rose to make a gentlemanly interruption. Perhaps my learned friend would be good enough to tell us the name of this alleged organization. Oh, doesn't my learned friend know it? I carefully simulated amazement. The name is to be found on that blood-stained scrap of paper. The prosecution's Exhibit 1. I held out my hand and the usher got it for me. Thank you, usher. It reads, Sunlight Children of Sun. They call themselves the Children of Sun, don't they, Lord Freeth? We had the jury's undoubted interest as he answered. I believe that's what they're called, yes. And they offer blood to children of dark. We've been told that the document was written by your client in the deceased's blood, Mr. Rumpole. Bullingham was beginning to feel out of his depth, and so, as usual, he attacked the defence. My lord, there hasn't been a scrap of evidence about it, I told him, feeling the jury watching me closely. Mr. Morton Colfax has told us that he's calling Professor Ackerman. No one knows more about bloodstains than Professor Andrew Ackerman. Bullingham gave the jury a glowing trailer for a prosecution witness. I think your lordship may find that somebody does, I said, with a certain amount of quiet confidence. That would surprise me, Mr. Rumpole. Life in your lordship's court is full of surprises. I suppose that's why some of us find it so enormously enjoyable. Some of the jury appeared to enjoy this, so Bullingham resumed his impatient growl. Have you got any more questions for Lord Freeth? This must be a very painful experience for him. It wasn't exactly a Sunday school treat for my client either, I thought. And then I asked the usher for Exhibit 2. I was handed, carefully labelled and wrapped in plastic, the long commando-type sheath knife that had been found inside Simpson's bag of fried chicken, which he dumped in a dustbin outside his bed sit. I unwrapped it and examined it carefully in full view of the jury. Then, after pause long enough to create a suitable tension and feeling of expectancy, I turned to the witness. Lord Freeth, your brother went to Sandhurst, I think. Yes, he did. And spent some 5 years in the army? Yes, until my father died and left him the farm. Lord Freeth received the knife from the usher, gave it a cursory glance, and put it down in the front of the witness box. Do you know that this is a regulation army knife of the sort issued to officers and men undergoing special commando training? I didn't know, but I accept that from you, of course. Lord Freeth was never less than courteous. After the next witness, the detective inspector had read out in a monotonous tone of voice and from his notebook his account of the police interview with Simpson, I rose to cross-examine. Mr. Wargrave, you say that my client told you that he was guilty. That's what I've got down in my notebook. I suggest he never used the word guilty at all. He said he had sinned. Doesn't it come to exactly the same thing? The judge asked. I decided it was time to give him a little basic theology. Hardly, my lord. Every clergyman at morning prayers says, I acknowledge my transgressions and my sin is before me. That can hardly be taken as an admission of stabbing people down the underground. I picked up the commando knife and weighed it in my hand. Officer, this knife, Exhibit 2, would seem to be the fatal weapon. It would seem so, sir. And yet my client possessed a knife, a curved oriental dagger which you found on his dressing table. I did, yes. The jury can see that in the police photograph of my client's room, next to the blood-stained letter, photograph number 4 in your bundle, members of the jury. The 12 old darlings leafed through their bundles of photographs and found the place. We know there were no bloodstains on the dagger. I believe not, the detective conceded. So it comes to this, doesn't it? My client's knife had not been used, but what had been used was a commando knife of the sort that Mr. Cantor might have had. Might have had, yes. Detective Inspector Wargrave sounded dubious as ever. And there were 2 sets of fingerprints on the handle of that knife, Exhibit 2, somewhat blurred. The fingerprints of my client and those of the deceased gentleman. That is so, yes. And my client's hands were cut, and his clothing cut in some places. Yes, indeed. So what does that indicate to you, Inspector? I suppose it might indicate some sort of struggle for the possession of the knife, Bullingham said, unable to sit quietly and listen to the evidence. The learned judge had played straight into my hands. I gave him a low bow in which there was only the faintest touch of mockery. Oh, I am extremely grateful to your lordship. Your lordship is always the first to appreciate points in favour of the defence. For a moment Bullingham was speechless, but then he looked at the clock and was saved by it. We'll break off now. Shall we say until 2:05, members of the jury? Professor Andrew Ackerman, that most distinguished pathologist, had been associated with death in its various forms for so long that he seemed to be ageless. Professor Ackerman, have you ever tried to write a message of this sort in blood? I asked. For the purpose of this case, I did so. It is quite possible, yes. The professor was nothing if not thorough. Blood clots in 2 or 3 minutes, does it not? I asked him. Yes, but there would have been continued bleeding from the deceased in this case. So Mr. Simpson would have had to have written this while he was with the deceased. He couldn't have taken blood home with him because it would have clotted. That is so, yes. The evidence is that he was unobserved on the platform for about 5 minutes between the arrival of 2 trains. He would have had time to write this message during that time, perhaps with the blood on the dagger. It is possible. Just possible, but an extremely strange thing to do. The suggestion is, Mr. Rumpole, that you have an extremely strange type of client. I'd left myself wide open to that sort of crack from the bull. What blood group did the deceased belong to? The deceased was Class O, whereas my client, Mr. Simpson, is of Group A. He is A from the sample I took from him. The professor glanced down at his notes. And you came to the conclusion that the blood which wrote that letter was Class O blood, and therefore likely to be Mr. Cantor's. The usher took the exhibit to the professor, who looked at it again, turning it over with long and surprisingly delicate fingers. It responded to the test that way? Yes. You took a minute particle of paper, treated it chemically to detect the antigens, and examined it under a microscope? Precisely. Professor Ackerman, when did you think this letter had been written? I assumed, as it was Mr. Cantor's blood, that it must have been shortly after the murder. I gave a small sigh of satisfaction.
Ackerman had accepted the instructions given him, and for once hadn't asked questions. "But supposing," I said, "it had been written months before. Suppose my client joined a somewhat dotty religious sect, a sect which required him to write an oath or motto in drops of his own blood." "But it wasn't his blood group, Mr. Rumpole." Ackerman smiled patiently. "But if it had been, and had been done months before, wouldn't the blood have perhaps faded in its strength?" It was the key question, and the professor considered it. His answer, when it came, was perfectly fair. "I suppose they might. I hadn't considered that." "Consider it now, Professor, I beg of you. The various constituents of blood stains fade in time, don't they?" "Yes, they do." He picked up the paper again with delicate fingers and looked at it thoughtfully. "And blood becomes more difficult to classify." "I would say less easy." Even this caution was good enough for me. "Less easy, thank you. But the constituents don't fade evenly, do they? Some factors in the blood may vanish before others." "That is possible." "You found my client's blood was A. Cantor's was O. After that finding, you didn't do more tests to break down the classification further?" "No. The situation seemed perfectly simple." "Oh, Professor, let's keep it simple." I couldn't resist saying, "for the benefit of the learned judge." I went on before there could be any grumbling from the bench. "I feel sure that members of the jury will have my point already. Is it not possible that after my client had written this absurd message in his own blood and kept it, the blood became less accurately classifiable, and then gave you an O result?" There was a long pause, during which I hoped I could feel the mystery which surrounded Simpson's defense was beginning to clear. Professor Ackerman picked up the paper again, put it down, smoothed it out, and then said, and the words were music to my ears, "I think the theory you have advanced is a possible one." The bull, of course, was looking disconcerted as he turned to Ackerman. "Let me get this clear, Professor," he said, and I hope he was capable of it. "Are you saying this letter may have been written by Simpson months before for some sort of religious reason in his own blood, and may have nothing to do with this murder?" "I think now that may be so, my lord." Ackerman's careful answer was impressive. "And you can't be sure that it was, in fact, written in the victim's blood?" "In view of the possibility that Mr. Rumpole has pointed out, no." It was then that I silently blessed the good Ackerman and wished him many long and happy years in the morgue. "Yes, thank you, Professor," the bull said, tamed by the professor's authority. "I think I understand." Wonder of wonders. And I had to hand it to the dear old bull. I think he did. "No miracle," I assured my client when we met in the cells at the end of the day, and he was half smiling when he said, "No. The universe has recovered its balance. There is a perfectly clear scientific explanation." "I suppose so," he conceded. "They can't work miracles, Duchess. You've got nothing to be afraid of." "Haven't I?" He still sounded doubtful. "You can tell the jury the truth now." There was a long silence. Then I pressed him again. "Tell it. You've got to tell it for the sake of—" "For your sake." There was no mistake about it. He was smiling now. I shook my head. "For the sake of a lot of lonely people," I told him, "who go out looking for miracles."
Calling your own client in a murder case is always an extremely dodgy and nerve-wracking business. What made it more alarming in Simpson's case was that I really had no very clear idea of exactly what he was going to say. After the formalities of getting his name and previous good character were over, I started where I had first heard of Notting Hill Gate underground murder in the Sunshine State. Last summer, I think you went on a holiday to Florida. Did you meet someone in the street handing out leaflets? Once he began to talk, Simpson was articulate, and the old dead look had left him. He seemed so clean and respectable. He was wearing a tie and a clean shirt. We started to talk about loneliness and how to make friends. Oh, and then about all the meanness and cruelty in the world. He took me to meet his friends. Where were they? In a sort of farm. It was called the Sun Valley. They were all nice and cheerful. They sang a lot, and they seemed to work very hard. And later I met a man. He was dressed as a clergyman. They called him the Master. What did he tell you? My lord, how can this be relevant? Morton Colfax rose to object, and wonder of wonders, the bull, impressed by the quiet young clerk in the witness box, said, I think we can let Mr. Simpson tell his story. What did he tell you? I repeated the question gratefully. He told me I must work for him in their accounts department. He said that when the children of the sun took over the government of the world, I should have some great post in world economics. I was going to be their Minister of Finance. Did you believe him? Yes, I'm afraid I did. Simpson smiled, a small apology for a huge presumption. Did you start to work on the books? Almost at once. What did you find? There were hopeless discrepancies. Simpson looked pained. A great deal of money was coming in. The friends and brothers gave all their worldly goods. None of this money was accounted for. I'm afraid I came to the conclusion that the whole organization of the Children of Sun was a gigantic swindle. Did you tell anyone that? Oh, we weren't allowed close friends. They told us that would destroy our loyalty to the group, Simpson explained. But there was a young American man I worked with. I told him one night. He said he'd have to go to the master and denounce me as a traitor. And that's when I decided to escape. There was a truck going out of the farm gate with vegetables. I hid in the back of it. And then? Then I went back to England on the next plane. I'd managed to keep the ticket. Back to your work in the Inland Revenue? Of course. Were you afraid at all? Yes, I was. I knew I had found out things in Florida that the Children of Sun wouldn't want to be known. I told myself that I was back in England and that they'd have no way of finding me. But I often got the feeling that I was being watched when I left home. Once or twice I thought I was being followed. Nothing definite, you understand, just an uneasy feeling. Yes, I understand. Mr. Simpson, will you tell me your routine movements on Thursday evenings? Well, I used to go to my evening class. In advanced accountancy? Yes. And on the way home I would buy my supper at the delectable Drumstick in Notting Hill Gate and take the train on to Paddington. Anyone who'd been watching you over a long period would know that? Yes, I suppose they would. Did you think anyone was following you or watching you on that evening of Thursday, March the 13th? Well, I had an uneasy feeling, nothing definite, not until the man spoke to me on the platform. The man? Mr. Cantor. Just tell the jury about that, will you? In your own words. He was out on his own, but I had fear for him. The jury were listening attentively, and he told them, quietly and clearly, how the son-child, Rory Cantor, tried to kill him, and how he fought with an unexpected passion for life, and how the knife was turned on his attacker. When he had finished, I said, Mr. Simpson, why didn't you tell this story to the police when you were arrested? I thought
The power of the master had changed the blood on the letter. I thought it was a miracle.
Well, how do you feel now you know it wasn't a miracle?
In a way, disappointed.
No miracle, I told the jury in my final speech. Perhaps we are a little disappointed also, members of the jury, to discover that this is just another case about human violence and human greed. Or perhaps it is a case in which, after all, the powers of darkness had their terrible part to play. I was holding the knife as a prop for the jury's attention, but I didn't need it. The old darlings were all listening intently as I went on. Mr. Simpson discovered the secrets of a fraud practiced upon the gullible and the lonely. Mr. Simpson was to be killed, and a faithful servant of the master, a young fanatic who had been trained in war, named Rory Cantor, a man who just presented his own large property to this bogus messiah, was to be the agent of death. What happened? Cantor no doubt followed Simpson that night and waited for him on the platform of the underground station. He accosted him and pulled a knife. He started the attack. You've heard from my client how these two men fought for this knife, on which were the fingerprints of both of them. You've heard how my client's hands were wounded in the struggle and his clothes cut, and finally, forcing Cantor's arm away from him, the point of the knife entered his attacker's body between the third and fourth ribs. It was a desperate fight, members of the jury, because Cantor was a man who believed he had God on his side. The day the trial ended happened to coincide with the visit by Phillida to Ken Cracknell's community near King's Cross. This proved to be a comfortable and elegant Victorian house in a pleasant square behind the Gray's Inn Road, which young Cracknell shared with a group of friends whose communal living didn't go beyond sharing a kitchen and occasional meetings to talk through problems in the interface of domestic group relationships. Fortunately, most of his cohabitees were out when Ken brought Miss Trant home. She passed the sitting-room door with some trepidation, and she didn't relax until they were in Ken's comfortable and brightly furnished bedroom. He had thoughtfully removed the bedspread and turned back the sheets before he went to court that morning. She looked at the bed, smiled, and kissed him. Then, as he drew the curtains and adjusted the lighting effects, she took off her jacket, hung it neatly on the back of a chair, and started to undo her shirt. "Happy?" she asked Ken Cracknell. For an answer he returned to kiss her. "Are you happy, Ken?" Well, she was taking off her shirt, and he was offering her apparently every assistance. "Happy about you being here?" "You should be happy about everything. You had a marvelous win." "Did I?" Ken Cracknell paused discontentedly in the act of disrobing Miss Trant. "Of course, Rumpole did it. But I'm sure you were a terrific help." Rumpole. Ken appeared unexpectedly angry, and his fingers stopped working at the clips and buttons. Miss Trant looked at him in surprise. "Yes," he muttered. "Blast the man, Rumpole pulled it off." "What's wrong with that?" Miss Trant looked up at him, puzzled. At which Ken Cracknell burst out with thoughts which he had had to keep to himself for too long. "What's wrong with it? Don't you see it means he'll never go? He'll be round my neck forever, swamping the desk with his papers and dropping ash like a bloody volcano. That's not why I got him the job." "Why? Why did you get him the job, Ken?" She was moving away from him, looking at him with sudden suspicion. "Well—" He seemed, as he looked at her, to have some doubt about answering, but she insisted. "Why did you get Rumpole to lead you?" It seemed a hopeless case anyway." He was almost apologetic, and his apology gave her the answer. "You wanted him to lose." Now she was working hard, doing up all the clips and buttons that Ken had so eagerly, if awkwardly, unloosened. "You thought he'd vanish back into the sunset if he lost another case. That's why you did it, isn't it? You wanted him to lose.
so you could have him out of your room." "Philly!" Ken's protest was ineffective. She continued to button with determination. "Well, let me tell you something." Her eyes were no longer soft, but shining with the power of her sudden eloquence. "You're wrong about Rumpole. He's the radical. You're not. You'll grow up to be a prosecutor or a circuit judge. But Rumpole never will, because he says what he thinks, and because he doesn't give a damn what anyone thinks about him. And because he can win the cases you're afraid even to do on your own." "Oh, Philly, don't talk to me like that. Don't I mean anything to you?" Ken Cracknell moved toward her, pleading. She looked at him and said almost with regret, "Oh, yes. You're a pretty face around Chambers, a little bit of fluff, a reasonably good spot of crumpet. But don't ever get the idea I'd risk a good husband who knows how to cook for you, Ken Cracknell." Christmas came with its usual alarming rapidity. On the night of our Chambers party, our members arrived with their wives and girlfriends. "Quiet, everyone," called out Henry, our self-appointed master of ceremonies. Guthrie Featherstone cleared his throat. "Christmas has put gifts in several of our stockings this year. Horace Rumpole had a very good win in an interesting murder down at the Old Bailey." "Did that surprise anyone?" I asked the world at large. "It surprised Ken," said Mrs. Phillida Erskine-Brown, née Trent. Ken Cracknell glowered at her, whereupon she raised her glass to her husband Claude and said, "Happy Christmas, darling." "And Owen Glendower Owen," Featherstone continued, with our rule of honour or list of legal triumphs, "has been appointed by the Lord Chancellor to the circuit bench. Our loss is Mid Wales's gain." When the cries of "Splendid! Yes, of course! Well done, Owen!" and "Good show, Judge!" had died away, I quickly pointed out the full consequences of the joyful news. "Which leaves an empty space in my old room," I said, and looked hard at Featherstone. After all, he had made a private promise, and I wanted it publicly confirmed. Yes, well, we'll consider that, of course, at the Chambers meeting." It was typical of Featherstone to seek to put off the final, fatal decision. I wasn't letting him get away with it. "We'll consider it now," I insisted. "Oh, I'm sure it's a matter you'll want to discuss with your family, Horace." Featherstone tried to sound conciliatory. "No one wants to force you back from your retirement just because we happen to have a gap in Chambers. I'm sure Hilda has views." "Views?" No doubt Hilda had. She had about most things, but I didn't think she would feel called upon to speak at what was rapidly becoming a Chambers meeting. I was wrong. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I have," she said in a profound and doom-laden voice. "Mrs. Rumpole, Hilda, all in good time." Featherstone clearly didn't want my wife's views to mar the festivities, but she overruled him. "Since we got back from our holiday in the States," Hilda began. "Holiday? Did she say holiday?" Uncle Tom was puzzled. "I thought they'd gone out to grass for good." "Since Rumpole's been back in harness," Hilda was now in full flow, "he has, of course, had an enormous success in a most important murder trial, and I'm quite convinced that his real love is a Judge Bullingham." Oh, really, Hilda? I didn't know what she'd come out with next, but she looked at me and appeared to be smiling. "I'm joking, of course," she said. "Oh, yes, of course. I was glad to hear it." "And I'm more convinced than ever that my duty is here, at Rumpole's side," Hilda went on. My heart sank, I must admit it. "Are you sure?" I asked hopelessly, but it seemed she had come to a firm decision. "So I shall stay in England," she said, "to look after Rumpole." She who must be obeyed had spoken. "How long will you be staying this time, Rumpole?" Uncle Tom asked, and as I felt an old legal anecdote coming over me, I gave him his answer.
How long? I said. Who knows how long? I well remember that terrible old Lord Chief when I was first at the bar. He gave an 86-year-old man 15 years for persistent theft at Bodmin Assizes. But, my lord, the old man quavered, I shall never do 15 years. Well then, my man, the Lord Chief encouraged him, you must do as much of it as you can. I looked round the room at them all. There was a sudden, rather chill silence, and no one laughed. That's all I can say, I told them. I shall do as much of it as I can. And a very happy Christmas to you all.